Didn't work, though. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the second meeting of the Mayor's Commission on Climate. Thanks to all the commissioners for being here and to the staff of both Sacramento and West Sac for being here and participating in the process, and to our members of the public. 3 of our commissioners are unable to be here today. They're at a conference in DC, but they have sent representatives, and I'll ask them later for some brief comments. But Shelley Jang, they're all sitting in the front. Shelley Jang is here representing Alberto Ayala of the Sacramento Air Quality District. Chris Flores is here representing Henry Lee of Sacramento RT, and Casey Lazan is here from SACOG representing James Corliss. So I wanted to let you know that they're here. A few other commissioners aren't here yet, but we're expecting them soon. So before we start today, I think it's important that as we are all gathered here at City Hall, that we acknowledge that today represents the 1-year anniversary of the tragic death of Stephen Clark. So I would like to ask you to join me in a moment of silence to honor the memory of Stephen and to reflect upon our compassion for his family, his friends, and the community. Thank you. So on to our meeting on climate change. Our first meeting at the end of November was really an overview and more of an introductory session, and today I'm really excited. We're really going to be diving into some very substantive recommendations and tackling some challenging and important topics. I also want to mention in November we met during the daytime, we met in the afternoon, but we got some feedback from some interested members of the public asking if we could change the meeting time to early evening so that there'd be more opportunity for those who can't break away from work or school. So thank you for making the change and for meeting during the evening hour. I just want to briefly go over today's agenda. We're going to start with some progress updates and some background information that Kate Meese from LGC will present. And then we'll turn to the focus of the meeting, which is the recommendations that we'll hear from our expert committee, we call it the TAC, on the built environment in our cities. They've worked really hard. They've met 3 times, and they have some very in-depth recommendations. And we'll also hear from Dan Hamilton, the sustainability director from the city of Oakland, on what they've done in this area. And I think that'll really give us some good context and inform our discussion. And then we've allowed about an hour for a substantive discussion among the commissioners. And really the goal of that discussion is to get your feedback and input on the recommendations and to develop a set of questions that we can send back to the expert committee. They'll be meeting one more time to think about those issues and then report back to us at the next meeting. And then at the end of that, we have half an hour set for public comment, and that input, of course, is essential as well. Before we start, I just want to reiterate the mandate from both of our mayors, from Sacramento and West Sac, and the commitment that we made in November. Our mission is to identify goals and priorities for achieving carbon zero by 2045. And with every day that goes by, it becomes increasingly apparent how urgent that is. We need to approach this with urgency and to recognize that transformation at a very big scale is necessary to make this happen. And our mission is also to ensure that the transition to carbon zero happens in a way that advances social equity and that we make sure we have a focus on our most vulnerable communities. So I ask that you all keep that in mind today as we go over the recommendations. So any questions before we get started? Hi, Meg. Welcome. All good? Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Kate for a progress report. Thank you.
Thanks, Ann. So we have made a lot of progress, even though we may have seemed a little silent between the commission meetings. As Ann mentioned, we've had a really active built environment working group, technical advisory committee, that has met 3 times, had a lot of really good dialogue at those meetings, in between the meetings via email and shared Google Docs and a number of other tools. So we're going to hear from Obadiah, who has been so gracious from SMUD to lead that technical advisory committee and has really put a lot of time in, which we've appreciated, in addition to all the committee members who've really rolled up their sleeves and jumped in on this. You have the report, commissioners, in your packet, so hopefully you've had a chance to review some of the recommendations, but we'll get a high-level overview from Obadiah as well. The next step on that will be to hear input from all of you as commissioners and also from the public as well, to take back for a 4th committee meeting, which will be oriented towards finalizing those recommendations to include in our final report back to the mayors. We've also had staff that have been working on a background analysis, so as issues have come up through the technical advisory committee and from the commissioners at the last meeting, we've had staff doing a lot of research to see what best practices are around for other communities that may have tackled issues that are already coming up. So there's been a lot of research that has gone into some of the things that you'll see today. We've also had the privilege of partnering with the Capital Region Readiness Collaborative on a survey. We've gotten over 100 responses to the survey that asks a number of questions, 1,000, thank you, 1,000 responses to the survey. 100 wouldn't be great. 1,000 responses to the survey. The survey is going to stay open for a while longer, but that will give us some great information about how community members are looking at issues of climate change and resiliency, and we'll be bringing that back to all of you as commissioners and make that available on our website for the public as well. So I think we'll get some good information through that survey. And we've also launched a blog to share information related to carbon neutral goals and climate action, and that's available on our website as well. So if you want to stay engaged in between meetings, commissioners or the public, please take a look at our website and you can do so there. Let's see, so moving forward, I mentioned the 4th TAC committee meeting for the built environment to finalize the recommendations. We will also be kicking off our next TAC, which will be focused on mobility. So we've got a number of experts and interested parties from around the region that will be engaging and developing recommendations for advanced mobility in the region. And similarly, those will be presented at our next full commission meeting. So you can look forward to that. We've really appreciated the engagement from all of the commissioners and the folks that have been involved in the TAC and the public as well. So thank you so much for that. And one of our commissioners has agreed to do something extra for this process, which I think will be really valuable. So I want to turn it over to Julia Burrows to talk about the Youth Summit that's coming up.
Thanks, Kate. So at the first agenda, I raised my hand and said, I think we need to take the Climate Commission on the road to our young people. And to that end, we will have 2 youth summits. The first one will be hosted by Sac State. Thank you, Dr. Nelson, and your outstanding students on campus. The university student event will be hosted April 10th. It's a Wednesday. And the way that we've structured that is to have welcome remarks at 10 a.m. by Mayor Steinberg, and we will have 4 sessions of facilitated brainstorming during the day and evening, with remarks also by Mayor Cabalden at 6 p.m. on April 10th at campus, because we really want to hear from the students on the actions and recommendations that we should be including in the plan. So Wednesday, April 10th, starting 10 a.m. on campus, 4 rotating brainstorming sessions, and we have the professors from the environmental studies departments, the engineering departments, and the social justice departments also inviting their classes to attend and participate as their class for that week. So we anticipate having actions and recommendations from hundreds, literally, of students that day. The evening sessions are intended to also welcome Los Rios, Consumnes, and UC Davis students to participate. And so we'll push out the flyer in the social media for those events at Sac State. The hashtag is green is gold. developed by the students, so you'll start seeing social media pushed out for April 10th. One of the other opportunities at the students' request is for the students to actually facilitate the brainstorming. So on Saturday, April 6th, we'll do facilitator training at noon, and the students that participate as facilitators will also earn a leadership certificate on site. So it's all in. Kudos to the Associated Student Executive Vice President Rachel DePorto, who is studying civil engineering, and she needs to be hired by all of you immediately who are running engineering firms. She's the most organized student I have ever met on campus, and we will take the recommendations from the students and forward those as a report to the commission. We'll also leave a Google Doc open for anyone who didn't get to participate in one of the facilitated sessions afterwards to take their input as well. So Wednesday, April 10th, university students input. And we just confirmed the high school student summit for Saturday, April 27th at River City High School in West Sacramento. So we'll have the university students in Sacramento and the high school students in West Sacramento, 9 to 1 on campus. That day will include an education session again on what is carbon zero. We'll break out into brainstorming sessions. They have a fantastic solar array on campus that the students will have a tour of, and then we will feed them because more show up when there's pizza or something for lunch. So many thanks to Councilmember Chris Ledesma, who I understand might be under the weather, and to Megan Powers, who is our UC Davis intern in the audience, who will be working on the high school summit for us. So shout out to Megan, and thank you to Bernadette Austin to making that internship possible for her to help us. Our goal there is 100 to 150 high school students who again roll up action items for the recommendation. So the call to action and invitation to the commissioners and to the public is please promote the summits when you see the social media and those advertisements start. Please attend the summits, all are welcome. If you can pop in for a part of it or all of it, we welcome you. If you would like to facilitate a session, you can go through the facilitator training or I'll give you the agenda. And we may need that to happen because we're anticipating an overwhelming audience, especially at the Sac State event. And if you would like to sponsor the lunch or the t-shirts at the high school summit, let me know. And with that, April 27th and April 10th will be great days for outreach to take the Climate Commission on the road.
Great, thanks, Julia. I want to thank you. I know how much time you put into this, and it's very exciting. And I had the opportunity to meet with Julia and the Sac State students, and it blew me away. They're outstanding and very committed. I hope we'll get to hear maybe from the students in person.
And they will come and present. Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. And our next item is back to Kate on the working definition of carbon zero. This is an informational item.
We've had a lot of questions about what exactly we mean by carbon zero or carbon neutral. So in your packet, you'll see we have compiled a definition that has been gathered from cities and counties who have looked at this issue and also organizations that are helping define the criteria that should be considered going into a definition of carbon zero. As you can see, what we're looking at is carbon zero being interpreted to mean carbon neutral, specifically that the net greenhouse gas emissions of Sacramento and West Sacramento equals zero. So our primary focus is going to be on achieving near zero greenhouse gas emissions through deep carbon reduction. So we're really focusing on the reduction side of the equation. And you can see there are a number of considerations we included as part of the definition based on the best practices we saw when we were researching this item. But again, this is a working definition. It's intended to guide the conversations and provide some consideration, but it's not our determination on exactly what the definition should be moving forward. It's intended to guide the conversation.
Thanks. Kate, questions on this? Anyone? Right, Mike?
Waste that goes into the waste stream, is that included in carbon?
We haven't looked into Oh, I got turned off. So we haven't had a discussion about that, about whether the life cycle cost would be included in this. So at this point, we're looking at how the cities are measuring greenhouse gas emissions at this point, and would be looking to get those emissions to net zero. So a number of those items you discussed, they are not currently measuring.
Okay, anyone else? Yeah, I don't see a speaker queue, so I'll watch for your lights, but raise your hand. Flo.
So thank you for this, because I think it's helpful to have something to respond to. I would love to see a definition of carbon included in here as well. I'd also like to express some concern about including the offsets as part of the reduction definition, and maybe even putting some parameters on exactly what our maximum allowance is going to be for offsets in terms of the definition. Because I think, this can create, I love that we have some parameters here in terms of being equitable and being timely and verified and all of that, but a last resort, I'd like to know what steps we have to go through to make sure that it's really a last resort and it's not something that we're relying on to be a good bulk of this. So I just want to register that as something that I think needs to be parameterized a little bit better in terms of what exactly is a last resort, and and how willing are we going to be to rely on offsets as part of this definition.
Yep.
Okay, good comment. We don't want it to be the proverbial slippery slope, right? Lori?
I think when we talk, well, first of all, thank you, Flojan. I totally agree with you on that. I think when we talk about carbon, we're using it sort of as a shorthand for all kinds of carbon, all kinds of greenhouse gases, and perhaps that could be defined a little bit better.
Trish, did you have a comment?
No, I didn't.
Okay. That's okay. Okay, anyone else? And we'll wrap this up. Oh, Arlen, hi.
Just to kind of tee off on a couple of thoughts around carbon, I think it is important to create a definition around what do we mean by net zero carbon. I think if you think about an important part of this region is agriculture, and there are significant emissions associated with agriculture, and I think we need to be mindful of the impacts to small farmers, especially small dairymen, et cetera, because that can be, so I think as we think about this, we need to be really clear on what's the reach and who are we actually specifically targeting. So I think that a definition, I think, is important. And then just on the thought of offsets, I do agree that there should be some parameters around it, but I also think that as we move forward, we also need to be mindful that many of the carbon reduction efforts can be very expensive. And so the question of who pays and how we pay for it. So a balance of achieving that carbon goal, which I think is extraordinarily important, but at the same time, making sure that we're balancing that against cost to people, because someone has to pay for a very ambitious goal, and that's everyone in the region. So, and obviously the impacts will be different depending on who those folks are. So just to be mindful of that as we adopt these longer term goals.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, we'll take all that back and refine the definition, and it'll evolve as we go, I'm sure. Okay, our next topic is the recommendations from the Technical Advisory Committee. So I want to introduce Obadiah Bartholomew. He's from SMUD. He manages their climate and distributed energy strategy. He's been at SMUD for 16 years on clean energy and climate, and is quite the expert on the topic. He did an amazing job. I want to thank you up front, Obadiah. He facilitated our TAC meetings and did a great job on that, and really pulled people together. So Obadiah's presentation is about 20 minutes, and then we're going to take about 10 minutes just for clarifying questions. We thought it would be best if Obadiah can go all the way through his presentation. We'll do some clarifying questions, then we'll hear from the gentleman from Oakland, and then we'll come back to our substantive discussion. So that's our plan for now.
Great, well, thank you.
Obadiah, take it away.
Thank you very much, Anne. It's an honor to be here to convey to you the recommendations from just a wonderful set of technical leaders in the topic of buildings, land use, and green space that I was lucky enough to be able to convene and coordinate their recommendations. I really just want to emphasize how fortunate we are here in Sacramento to have the resources we do in the form of the people, the human capital that is going to be able to make this happen. So as we think about the level of ambition that the milestones and vision that I'm going to present call for, know that we have a lot of resource in the way of people who know how to get some of this done. So from an agenda for my talk, I'm going to start with the draft vision and talk about some of the key principles that will be required to achieve that vision. I'll talk about a catalyzing concept that was developed out of one of the TAC meetings to help give some inspiration and get your minds thinking about this kind of future state. And then I'll get into milestones and strategies for each of the categories of existing buildings, new construction, land use, and green space, and finish on potential funding sources. So the draft vision that we've come up with, I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. We envision compact, walkable communities that integrate efficient design, localized renewable energy systems, and nature-based solutions, leveraging carbon neutrality to achieve positive health, equity, economic development, and resiliency outcomes. Investments will match priorities, and strategies will be pursued in a manner that considers both costs, including avoided costs, and benefits. Communities will be fossil-free and fully electrified with an abundance of green space and affordable housing, designed to prioritize vibrant public spaces, multimodal and active transportation, resource conservation, and quality of life for all. This is the draft vision, thinking of Sacramento in 2045 as we reach towards this ambitious carbon zero goal. To achieve that vision, the Tech Advisory Committee for the Built Environment worked from these key principles. The first, that we authentically and inclusively engage our residents, stakeholders, businesses, and community leaders in this process. That we prioritize investments and projects in existing communities and in existing development, in particular in disadvantaged communities. That we align all plans with the Commission's recommendations by 2025, all local plans, so land use plans and other plans that the local agencies involved in this effort are responsible for. That we forge regional partnerships to support ambitious action on climate change. This isn't just the cities of Sacramento and West Sacramento, as we've talked about, but really a regional effort that we need to be thinking about and engaging those partners. And that we enable and implement the ambitious actions necessary to achieve the recommended carbon neutrality goal, essentially that we follow through. A catalyzing concept that was developed and kind of to set your minds in thinking about some of this future state was around zero carbon innovation zones. This was essentially establishing a zoning category that could attract research and development, investment, and to create eco-villages that really embody a living community challenge framework. And that is demonstrating a regenerative approach to development, specifically around energy, water, waste, food systems, and more. This zone would allow us to scale out experimentation with a variety of things, including tiny houses, micro-dwelling clusters, deep retrofits of existing buildings, and mixed-use infill. And finally, the last element of these zero-carbon innovation zones was that we would position our communities at the forefront of innovation and sustainable architecture as a model for the state, and really, as California is a model for so much more, really a model for the world. I also, before I get into the milestones and strategies, want to highlight a key challenge that's going to come up as a theme throughout these strategies, and that's around building decarbonization. The emissions from the natural gas combustion for appliances for space and water heating is really one of the largest challenges that California is grappling with today as we think about how we reach our long-term carbon objectives, and certainly that's true here in Sacramento. A number of cities across the state are grappling with this challenge. Between 20 and 30 are developing measures specifically targeted at this aspect of building emissions. And most of those are looking to building electrification as a core component of how we address this sector of emissions. The good thing is that there are really a whole bunch of benefits that we get from eliminating combustion. Those are health benefits, they're safety benefits, it's indoor air quality, outdoor air quality, they're cost savings for our residents. So really across the board, this is going to benefit the citizens of Sacramento and West Sacramento. And it's going to be a challenge to do. SMUD right now offers some of the most generous, probably the most generous incentives aimed at market transformation in the state of California. We also are here in what is one of the best regions to electrify, both from a climate but also from an electricity rate standpoint. It creates a tremendous opportunity to be a model in this space of building electrification. But to reach the long-term goals, this is really going to need local policy support moving beyond the kinds of voluntary action and levels of activity that we've traditionally seen in the energy efficiency space. So thinking about that key challenge, I'm going to launch into existing buildings. And as you'll see, these are going to represent a subset of the recommendations, both on the milestones and the strategy points. So there are actually about 5 milestones per category. I'm going to highlight 2 or 3 per category, just in the interest of time. So these are all going to be 2030 milestones. So what can we achieve in the next 11 years? So for existing buildings, residential, the first one is 33% of all homes would be all electric and fossil fuel free. And the group felt that that would be important, that a proportional share of single-family, multifamily, and low-income buildings and residents were participating at this 33% level. The next milestone was that 50% of all replacement space and water heating be electric by 2030. And finally, that we think about as we're building, or as we're addressing these buildings, the role that buildings play in charging electric vehicles and enabling electric vehicles, such that 30% of existing parking for multifamily would be dedicated for vehicle charging. As we think about strategies to get there, I mentioned kind of our past at SMUD. A number of our programs tend to be voluntary, and people participate as they are able to. But the scale we're talking about for building electrification really requires something more ambitious, something more aggressive, really, to meet this zero carbon goal. So the first strategy was really around how do we develop a pathway for a decarbonization code requirement, so that by some date certain, you would be, essentially, if you had a water heater that was a gas water heater and it failed, that you would be required to change it to an electric water heater. That is not to say that would be without incentives or financing mechanisms, but essentially we recognize that we can't get there with gas water heating, gas space heating operating at a significant level to get to the 2045 goal. And considering the life cycle of these appliances, we think that would be probably something on the order of needing to happen around 2030 or the early 2030s that we would have this type of a requirement. And so really in this interim time, we need to work towards that kind of a trajectory from an awareness standpoint, from a commitment to our residents that we're going to follow through on this. And as we observe today from residential permit compliance, in particular as we think about HVAC permit compliance, which is probably most similar, we have very, very low permit compliance, probably below 25% for HVAC installations. So if we're going to have a requirement that's in code, we need a code enforcement mechanism. And the group talked about this a fair amount. Point of sale, when a house turns over and it's refinanced, a new mortgage is established, is a mechanism that's been in place across the river over in Davis for quite a number of years, I think over 3 decades. And it's a model that we think could apply well here to create that stick to make sure that people take seriously the building code and the requirement that electrification is going to be mandated at some point. There'd need to be a significant amount of public outreach, obviously, to make sure that people were aware of this, that contractors were aware of this before this code requirement hit, so that by the time it does hit, the issue of home sales being slowed up by the process of a permit inspection gone awry, finding an HVAC replacement is required, is really minimal. And that's what they see across the river in Davis. Very minimal non-compliant code inspections. So it's very similar to inspections that happen today. For home sales, and it's not the kind of thing that we anticipate. If we do it right, if we're able to really establish the awareness up front of the key stakeholders, we don't expect it to slow up the home sales process. The last element, strategically, was really the importance of delivering energy efficiency and electrification together. And that is done so that we can ensure there's space on the electricity grid, that customers are really maximizing the bill savings, and they're creating really efficient envelopes to minimize the amount of electricity that's needed in these appliances. From the commercial building perspective, a similar type of target, eliminating fossil fuel use in 33% of existing buildings and achieving a 30% reduction in commercial building carbon emissions. How we accomplish those, a couple of the key strategies here, starting with expanding our building benchmarking. Right now that's a requirement of buildings over 50,000 square feet. We think pushing that down to a lower square footage level would provide the data to enable establishing a carbon rating system, which we are recommending be established, and targets for reduction of those buildings. These targets could be met through a variety of measures: electrification, energy efficiency, on-site or off-site purchased renewable energy, addressing high global warming, pollutant emissions from refrigerants. All of those items could be things that building owners could choose to do to reduce their footprint and comply with an emissions target. The second element is for smaller buildings. We think an equipment-based all-electric code requirement would be a potentially better approach, where those are more like a residential building owner or a small business owner who doesn't necessarily have the sophistication or the time really to be able to manage something like a carbon emissions reduction target. So those would be a appliance target for smaller buildings and a performance target for larger buildings by 2030. And then as well, establishing an enforcement mechanism. And here the discussion was around the use of point of sale or point of release of a building as being a potential opportunity for inspection, or the use of a fee-based approach, if feasible, that would enable creation of funding mechanisms to help other building owners go after these reductions. On the new construction side, we think we can move faster. We think that by 2030, 100% of new residential homes and 80% of new commercial buildings can be carbon neutral and should be in order to achieve these targets. This is really the most cost-effective place to get our zero carbon goals met early, and we think the city can be a leader, and the cities, can be leaders in establishing local codes necessary to make this happen. Significantly as well, new construction for electric vehicle charging is one of the biggest opportunities for low-cost charging to be put in place. And our milestone here was 30% of new commercial and multifamily spaces would be equipped with EV chargers. The key strategies that I'm highlighting for new construction, the first is pretty straightforward: develop a code requirement for all new construction to be 100% electric. We would like to see this happen sometime well before 2030, ideally in 2023 or 2026 at the latest code cycles. And then establishing REACH codes for EV charging infrastructure in multifamily and commercial buildings, making sure that we've got the charging in place to reach those 30% of parking spaces that would need to be electrified to be on track. And you'll hear, I think, more about that as we have the mobility TAC recommendations in terms of the scale of electric vehicles to expect. Moving on to land use, this group really had a tremendous amount of participation and engagement and recognition that this is critical. And as local leaders, this is obviously something a number of you are dealing with in your jobs very regularly. But it also touches a lot of other agencies. So a strong need for collaboration here on these land use measures. The first one in particular being true, establishing and enforcing an urban growth boundary at the regional level and having agricultural easements for the region. And the group felt that that was necessary not to wait until 2030, but that be a push to try and have happen by 2025. That we achieve an additional 35,000 new dwelling units and triple the current affordable housing units that are within a half mile of high-quality transit, and that 70% of city households pay no more than 35% of their income for housing. The key strategies I'll highlight for land use. The first was developing a regional urban growth boundary limited to existing urban development and already approved development projects. Then all planning and zoning would prioritize transit-oriented development and increase allowable density for single-family designations. The third strategy was around the creation of a locational efficiency metric to prioritize or incentivize developments. That could be based on walk score, vehicle miles traveled, CO2 equivalent emissions for development, siting, etc. The last category of recommendations that we had was in green space. And the milestones here were to achieve an average tree canopy of 25%. That would represent almost a 30% increase in our existing tree canopy, which is really highly ambitious, even though 25% doesn't sound like a lot. It's really quite significant, coming from our existing baseline at about 19%. The second milestone was around providing access to parks or green space, and really the desire was to see that within a 5-minute walk of all residences in the cities. Key strategies I'll highlight were planting 200,000 trees in disadvantaged communities and supporting those trees and those residents and the care of those trees with a well-funded tree care education program. Purchasing and using blighted or distressed properties to expand our green space, so maybe that as a mechanism to address the access to parks, and managing public open space and parks for enhanced carbon sequestration, which could provide some benefit towards the offset discussion that we were having earlier. Just a couple more slides. So how we pay for this is really a big question that was kind of posed during some of the dialogue earlier. Thanks, Arlen. And it's really a significant challenge. This is going to be a very significant investment for the region. So I'm highlighting a few. I think there were ultimately 10 or 11 recommendations in there, and the Tech Advisory Committee is going to circle back and do a little bit more on this topic as well in our 4th meeting. But the first one was really around coordination of local efforts to pursue existing state and federal grant opportunities, including the California Climate Investment Programs, increasing taxes and fees on vacant, blighted, abandoned, or unoccupied properties, transitioning property tax obligations from buildings to land, and increasing taxes on undeveloped land within the city. Adopting a financing district for encouraging development on abandoned, blighted, or undeveloped properties within the city. Working with the state to establish a statutory exemption from CEQA for projects that meet the Commission's climate and equity goals, and prioritizing infill development to reduce sprawl. Full implementation of SB 743 with the establishment of a vehicle miles traveled fee for new developments to support equitable VMT reducing projects. And finally, fees for buildings that are the poorest performing or in the lowest tier of this proposed building carbon emissions rating system that could be paid into a fund that would help finance upgrades for other buildings. The last slide I wanted to leave this on from a takeaway standpoint, we really need to substantially increase our efforts to promote more efficient land use and increase green space, as the land use and green space recommendations highlight. We also need to adopt transformative policies to promote all-electric buildings. I mentioned the really many very important co-benefits that come with that, the health benefits, the air quality benefits, and cost savings. As well, we reduce fugitive emissions from natural gas, which is a tremendous contributor to overall greenhouse gas emissions. We have the technologies that exist today. We don't need technology revolution to achieve this. We have the incentives that are required to make this a very cost-effective upfront investment, and as I mentioned, provide cost savings over the operating life of the equipment to our residents. And we're not alone. Several dozen cities are working on this actively across the state, including some of the largest jurisdictions setting really tremendously ambitious goals in this space. And I would expect announcements over the next coming several months from some of those cities. And lastly, I highlighted a few of the fees and other pricing mechanisms that could provide both a price signal and help fund transition away from fossil fuels. So I think that was the last slide, Ann.
Great. Thank you, Obadiah. Welcome.
Thank you.
To Chris Ledesma from West Sacramento. Glad you could make it. Thank you. Obadiah, thank you. It's obvious so much work went into this, and I think some of the TAC members are here, but I'm going to express our acknowledge and thank them as well. So what we're going to do now, we're right on schedule, is take about 10 minutes to do clarifying questions. Those are like the what did you mean by this question, and then we'll come back at 5:30 and go into some more probing, deeper questions.
Madam Chair,
Yes, sir. Steve.
I will have to leave about 5:30, so I may ask just for follow-up on something later. As we do these recommendations, it's unclear from the committee's work, so this is what I would like to have clarified, what the actual GHG reductions are from each of the recommendations, and some kind of, I imagine as we get further into this process, some kind of cost-benefit analysis. For instance, I love parks, but I don't understand the park recommendation as a greenhouse gas reduction strategy. And then, for instance, I like the idea of prioritizing infill, but particularly in disadvantaged communities makes me worry about gentrification and how we would manage anti-displacement in those neighborhoods. And those are things that aren't addressed. So as we get deeper into these things, there's a lot to tease apart. And we heard that from Michael Teal earlier around what carbon means. But I think these are very serious recommendations. Some of them, particularly the enforcement mechanisms, I have questions about the viability of those under existing law, or you mentioned permits. Getting people to pull a permit for an improvement is a challenge, partially because we've made it so hard, and sometimes because the cost of the permit versus the improvement is disproportionate. You have to pay a lot for a certain permit, and the work actually isn't that much, and so it really disincentivizes people, and that takes us out of that equation. So those are the kind of things that as we get further into this, Madam Chair, we clarify and drill down. I think we need the next level of analysis, and hopefully out of that will come some prioritization, where we get the most bang for the buck, where the low-hanging fruit is versus the harder things. And on the harder things, I think point of sale is really hard, because it places a disproportionate burden on the previous homeowner to do things that may not actually have cost recovery. You know, a lot of people who think about improvements to their house look at all these charts about the actual value at resale, and most of it that you're recommending may have zero benefit in resale, but have a tremendous cost. And so those are things we really have to consider, and it would be helpful to know more about as a policymaker.
So, yeah, several things in there to respond to. So I think there was a interest, certainly from the TAC, to get into the cost effectiveness, though from a capacity standpoint in the timeline we were not really able to do that in a meaningful way that we felt good about kind of sharing. So I think that's something that the city has been working with a consultant on their climate action plan, and we're hopeful that some of these measures can be dug into in more detail through that process and brought back to the commission at some point later on in this process to share that.
I saw Remy came up. Were you going to address that, Remy?
Yes, good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Remy Mendoza, Project Manager for the General Plan Update and Climate Action Plan. I would like to confirm that our consultant staff have been participating in the TAC meetings, and we think these ideas are really great. And as part of our Climate Action Plan, we will be evaluating all of these ideas for their GHG reduction potential, and as well as cost-benefit analysis and prioritizing them.
That's great. Thank you, Remy.
And then I think we can certainly loop back on the dialogue around concerns about the impact of some of the land use policies from a gentrification perspective, although would be also interested to hear ideas from any dialogue that you all have been a part of offline to kind of inform some of those recommendations, if there are things we should sort of caveat some of these land use recommendations to ensure that that's not an outcome that some of these unintentionally create. We can work those in. The other element, I'm sure we're going to have some further robust debate about the point of sale. I think the goal really is that would come in sometime later than the date certain all change outs are required to be electric, so that there would be time to start to transform that market and observe what the compliance rate is, and work towards informing people that that's going to be a policy that would be coming, so that that compliance rate hopefully would increase dramatically, and that would not impose a significant burden, but for maybe a few folks that still refuse to follow the permit requirement. But I'm sure we'll dive into that one in more detail later.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Yeah, and I think others want to speak on the point of sale issue as well, so we can delve into that a little later on in the afternoon. Thank you. Okay, so there was a special exception. No, it's okay, don't apologize, because Steve does have to leave at 5:30. But let's take a few minutes for any clarifying questions on the presentation. Mike. And then April.
Thank you. Oh, but I thank you for your leadership, and I'm sure a lot of hard work that went into this recommendation. You got to start somewhere, so thank you. You use the term legal pathways throughout the document, so it must be something important, and it must point to something. What does it point to in the TAC group? What are you thinking there? What does a legal pathway mean?
Sure. I think when we looked around, we had relatively little sort of legal precedent to look to and say, look, they've done it. It was found to be something that a city or region could establish a policy like this and be confident that they weren't overstepping their responsibilities. So I think that was sort of the primary driver of establish a legal pathway, is to make sure we were very clear on what the cities can and cannot do. And because that's a little unclear, I think that's where we decided to leave it, was a step short of explicit language of what we were going to do.
Hoping that when there's a will, there's a way. April.
I just had a clarifying question about the eco-villages. So just so that I'm clear, it would be a separate zoning for eco-villages, or it's a specific planned community of tiny homes that would exist somewhere?
So
was that fleshed out, or?
It wasn't fleshed out a whole lot beyond what's here, but I think the idea would be to establish a zoning category that might include some existing development in it and some space for new development in it that would sort of be designated as a zone for targeting this type of investment and a research focus. So we didn't have a specific parcel in mind necessarily. It was sort of a call out, and I think one of the things the TAC will be doing is spending a little additional time on ideas around demonstration projects. So I think that's going to be an opportunity to maybe get to a little bit more specifics on this idea.
My second clarifying question was, has the TAC talked about, I read a lot about affordable housing, but have they talked about affordable and accessible housing at all? Has that been brought up?
Yes, I think every subgroup on this TAC had that in some way embedded in their recommendations. I wasn't able to highlight all of those, but there were call-outs for increasing affordable housing, for making sure that our housing is affordable relative to income levels, for ensuring that we're decarbonizing our lower income households at the same pace as the rest of our general population.
I was asking about accessible housing, not just.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't recall if that came up in the discussions as a specific recommendation, but we can certainly take that back and look at what that might mean in the context of these recommendations.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, April. And that will be important to bring that back. Thank you. Is that Mike or Julia? Mike?
Yeah, sorry.
No, don't be sorry.
This is more of an education question. Are the state buildings included in commercial buildings? Or are they, like through their plan, are they included?
They are a big chunk of the commercial building floor space here in Sacramento. I think they will hopefully they will be as aggressive or more aggressive based on the state objectives, but as buildings here in the city footprint, I think, city's footprint, I think we would expect those to participate in these kinds of programs as well.
Thank you.
Okay, good question. Anyone else? Lori?
I just have got it. I have a question about some of these, looks like magic percentages. A lot of things are 30%, 33%, whatever by 2030. As you know, according to the IPCC special report, we need to make substantial reductions in greenhouse gases by in about 11 years. So if we're only getting 30% or 33%, I'm just wondering where you got those numbers. It seems to me we should be doing the biggest percentage, so 60%, 75% by 2030 if we're going to go to zero by 2045 rather than doing little incremental. So I'm wondering where you got those numbers.
I think it predominantly came through some of our participants' experience in different types of market transformation, and we're talking about really tremendous market transformation here, which is really challenging. So it's not to say that ambition-wise, the TAC members wouldn't love to see those numbers happen faster, and I think it was trying to balance our awareness that overall citizen awareness is very low for some of the things that we're proposing to do, and so we need to move in a way that we bring everyone along. So I think that was the balance point, is how quickly can we move and still bring everyone along, move things at a pace that doesn't impose costs that are too high to be politically acceptable and ultimately undermine support for this. So I recognize it's a balance, and certainly we need to move as fast as we can. I think the feeling was just that some of these lifts are going to require such market transformation that it's going to take us time to really pick up and have the workforce that's there recommending the electric heat pump option as an example. Today, if you call a contractor, you will most likely be talked out of switching to electric. So that's something that we have to work on, the folks that are selling these, and getting overall awareness raised to make sure that we can do this at the scale that we're proposing to do it.
So one more question along with that. When you're talking about the costs, are you taking into account the avoided costs of what climate change will do to this community?
We did not, I think that was talked about as part of the vision, but we did not dig into that question as the built environment TAC. I think most of the folks that are on the TAC are pretty well versed in climate impacts, but perhaps not on the specific dollar measure for Sacramento. I don't know that that came up.
It seems to me that it's really important, maybe that's not a clarifying question, but it's really important whenever you talk about cost, because it will be costly, but it will be even more costly to deal with the climate change effects. So one without the other leaves people without the information that they need.
Thank you, Lori. Robert? And then we'll move on to our next presentation.
I was also concerned about the 33s, 30s, 33, because I don't know what we're benchmarking against, so I don't know where we're really at. And some of those, when you're talking about electric charging stations in really hard to do in big buildings and things like that. So I would like clarification on that. But what I really appreciated was that at the beginning you said that we would authentically and inclusively engage residents. So I'd appreciate it if you could talk a little bit about what you mean by that and where we're going that, and also if you could talk a little bit about the urban growth boundary and how that would be engaged as well.
Sure. I can probably talk about the authentically and inclusively engaged residents. Although let me just touch on the 30%, 33%. I think most times when we're planning out over a 20-year horizon, we've got to kind of pick a trajectory that we feel like we can get sort of on the path that we're trying to go to. And considering we're trying to go to essentially 100% in many of these categories by 2045, the feeling was, somewhere between getting a third of the way there and half the way there over the next 11 years was about where we'd need to get to. We didn't have necessarily significant consulting resources, so we're relying on a lot of the calculations that have been done for other purposes and trying to adapt those to our purpose.
I understand that, but sometimes we have low-hanging fruit and sometimes we have high-hanging fruit. So to just have a cookie-cutter response that we're just trying to get to 30 because of a timeline doesn't really take into effect how difficult each one of these challenges are, and they will be different in each state. That's what I was trying to say.
Okay, fair. So on the authentically and inclusively engage, I think that really speaks to the need to be engaged with citizens through forums, through convening dialogue with different types of stakeholders across our community. So that needs to be built into any kind of a process of successfully reaching scale on these initiatives, including the key stakeholders that are going to be impacted by those. We did not necessarily develop a specific plan for that, but noted that that's going to be really critical for achieving success. And I'm sorry, the last part of your comment.
Urban growth boundary, because
boundary.
that will affect citizens greatly.
Yeah, so that's obviously a huge challenge that requires collaboration with regional partners. It's not something that is necessarily easily done in an isolated fashion, or you end up with development, right on the edge of your jurisdiction. So it really calls for a regional approach there that involves, I think, the cities becoming advocates for that with their regional partners and looking to make that a broader reaching and higher impact type of measure.
Thanks. On this 33 question, I think it would be helpful to ask the TAC, did you kind of get, stuck in the rut of a formula around 33% at 30? And just ask them to revisit that.
Okay.
Okay, guys, I'm going to take one more question, And as I say to my kids, I really mean it now. Dave?
Yeah, I had a question under potential funding sources. Talks about transition property tax obligations from building to land and increase taxes for undeveloped land within the city. So are you talking about a complete restructure of the property tax code? Because this would be inconsistent with the present structure under Prop 13, which is based upon purchase price.
Yeah, so I would say the concepts presented in the funding recommendations probably did not have as much benefit of as much time spent within the tax, so that was something that we wanted to have some follow-up discussion on in our fourth TAC meeting. So I can certainly take that back as a concern about whether or not the cities would actually have the ability, similar to some of the legal pathway discussion that we had
I guess they
previously.
can look at fees, but the changing of the property tax structure itself seems to be a major exercise.
Sure. Yep, good point. Thanks, Dave.
Okay, and we might take that up a little more later, thank you. Okay, with that, we'll turn to our next presentation. Why don't we say goodbye now to Councilmember Hanson? I know you're not leaving yet, but I don't want to interrupt later. No, definitely not. Thanks for being here. Our speaker is Daniel Hamilton, the Sustainability Manager from the City of Oakland. He has over 20 years' experience in managing sustainability programs, policies, and plans for local governments and utilities, and has led multiple award-winning projects across California and has taught professional and university courses in energy management and sustainability and green building design and construction. So we're excited to have you here. I want to give you the full half hour. We did kind of cut into our other discussion time. So we'll listen to your presentation, and then we'll try to do the same thing with the questions held till the end of the presentation.
Of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here. While I am the Sustainability Director of Oakland, I was a longtime Sacramento resident, so I am not just here out of professional courtesy. I'm here because of a genuine love for this region and wanting to see it move forward. So I'm vested in your success, and I hope what I have here to present helps along the way to get there. So many of the comments that this commission gave in response to Obadiah's summary for the TAC points are exactly in line with what I'm going to present here today. So I think you're going to find some useful information in here about specifically, to Arlen's point, who pays and how much do they pay. This is something that when I started in Oakland in 2014, our council members, our community came to us and said, we want to be more ambitious, we want to be more aggressive, but we need to know how to have the right conversation. Everything in Oakland is driven around equity. All climate programs are described as equity programs through a climate lens. These are ways to improve social outcomes, address historic inequities within our community, a way to address some of the previous disparities that communities of color, low-income communities, non-English speaking communities have faced in Oakland for generations. As a result of that, we took a very different lens to the type of work we were doing. We started by asking what we didn't know, not what we did. So the TAC came up with some beautiful recommendations there. A lot of those programs are moving in a lot of places, and it's wonderful to see that level of innovation. But what we actually found was we were running before we learned to walk. And so what I'm going to present to you today is how in Oakland over the last few years we learned to walk the climate walk. And I think this may help you as you're answering some of these questions about, as Steve said, some of the things on cost effectiveness, on prioritization, greenhouse gas by measure. Can you compare things in transportation to buildings? Do you know how to have that conversation from a policy perspective? Do you know what it genuinely means? We did not know that in Oakland. Our community members didn't know how to have it. The advocates didn't know the difference between getting a park in their community and getting electric vehicle infrastructure in there. Which was worse, the air quality coming from the cars or the air quality coming from leaking gas appliances in their homes? These are the questions we set out to answer. So, 3 basic questions that we learned we did not know. Understanding the true and total costs of climate actions. How much did anything actually cost? Truly inclusive costs of what that was going to mean to do it. Understanding how you pay for it if you did know those costs. And prioritizing them by cost effectiveness and impact. Our current climate action plan was given lots of fancy awards by international groups. We did not have any of those 3 things in that climate action strategy. We talk about this as foundational for how government is going to operate. We say this is the new normal. We're going to be treated seriously. It's going to be like water and roads, other forms of infrastructure. Would any of you policymakers accept a CIP that didn't have that information in it? Would any of you fund roadway projects or new capital investments? Arlen, you going to pay for a power plant that doesn't know those things? Like, this is, if we want to be taken seriously in these conversations moving forward, I think these are some of the fundamental things that we have to start incorporating into the strategy. So I want to show you how Oakland did it, see how you like it, what parts resonate, what parts don't. So to start with, understanding the true and total cost of actions. A few cities and counties have started doing this within their climate action plans just within the last year or two. A couple of examples, Oakland, La Mesa, San Diego County did this. There's a number of different tools for doing this out there. It's surprisingly simple to do. It's something that's not actually done, though. You can add up the cost of staff working on this. There are pretty good data points in the US and Canada on how much time staff are spending implementing these programs, like time of use sales, and on doing efficiency retrofit rebates and the like on these. Cities have started aggregating them, so there are some best case examples out there. City of Toronto is the most robust one to date for the Technical Advisory Committee to look at. Potentially, they looked at full socialized costs, cost to government, cost to private citizens, cost to industry, and aggregated all of them across their top actions. There are some real leaders in this pushing forward new methodologies, so there's a lot of ways to do this. In Oakland, we did it after the fact for our climate action plan. Council adopted a 10-year plan and had absolutely no idea what it was going to cost. We came back to them 6 years after and said, you adopted a $228 million plan. Can we have $228 million, please? Of course not. But they may have made different decisions if they knew what it was going to cost. And they certainly would have made different decisions if we told them where that $228 million was going to go. Which brings us to understanding how the costs are met. This is the trickiest part of what's in this presentation. Understanding of the costs are met. Obadiah listed about a dozen of the different ways that you can pay for things. As part of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, a group of cities got together about 3 years ago and mapped out all of the sustainable finance tools available to cities in the US and Canada. So in the city of Oakland, we said, great, we'll take that and we'll apply it to our existing climate action plan. We didn't think of it ahead of time, we'll think of it after the fact and hope that we produce something meaningful. So we had to tie 175 actions from a climate action plan into 53 finance strategies. Anyone think that sounds simple or easy? It looks like this. Every one of those things on the left is a financing source. Every one of those tiny things on the right is a climate action strategy. They vary in cost from $100, which is 2 hours of a fellow time to write a pamphlet on encouraging private landowners to lease their land for urban agricultural food production, to $65 million to build shore power program at the Port of Oakland so that all container vessels coming from China have to plug in and not use bunker fuel when they're next to our vulnerable neighborhoods. We had to try to show that in a chart. This is what happens when you don't plan. This is the cautionary tale of Oakland in showing that you can have an intentional strategy. We found we are very reliant on 4 or 5 funding sources. We are completely underutilizing about 20 more that are great opportunities for a place like Oakland. It was only in going through this exercise that we found out what we weren't using, where we were overly reliant or at least significantly dependent, so we can balance out some of our risk and have a more cognizant financing strategy moving forward. And for God's sake, fewer climate actions. 175 is way too many. And that leads me to the last point, which is the one I want to spend the most time on here with you. Prioritizing by cost effectiveness and impact. I think Steve hit the nail on the head with this in saying to have these conversations meaningfully from a policy perspective, you've got to know what counts. And this is what cities have struggled with. City struggles with this, industry struggles with this, the federal government has struggled with this. How do we truly analyze this? I was fortunate enough to be able to accompany Mayor Schaaf to COP21 in Paris. And while there, Bloomberg had his staff running around, and they had just agreed to take on Oakland as a city where they would come in and provide free pro bono consulting services to the city. So their sustainability director came up to me and said, all right, Mike told me I have to do something for you. What do you want? And I said, I can ask for anything? And he said, yes, you can ask for anything. I said, I want a greenhouse gas cost abatement curve for the city of Oakland. I want you to tell me specifically where I get the most bang for the buck in climate action strategy. And I want you to include every single action. Look at every possible thing. It took us 3 years. 3 years to answer that question. Bloomberg was only under contract for 18 months, so they were not happy with me by the end that they were still in Oakland when they really wanted to be somewhere else. But they did, and the resulting report of this is called the CURB tool. It's for curbing urban emissions. I know it's a terrible acronym, I apologize, but we didn't create it. It was actually a tool we co-opted from the World Bank and C40 and a few other partners. It allows you to do a lot of complex inputs into the cost of market actions, the cost of local labor, energy savings potential, everything about your grid and how it's going to change your vehicle fleet for your communities, a huge number of input, thousands of inputs that it takes to do this mapping and do it accurately within this. The good news is I told Bloomberg I only wanted one condition on their outputting report, that the files be made public for any city and county to use. So all of the work that Oakland did in this is public and is available. I share the files with absolutely everybody who wants them. You don't have to start this from scratch if you want to do it in your region. You can start from the Oakland files and simply change what's different about Sacramento. A lot of the state regulatory stuff is this exact same. A lot of the conditions on the ground, the market actors are the same here and in the East Bay. So this will hopefully speed up the process for cities that want to use this tool. There are other tools. I'm not advocating for this tool over others. I'm just giving you the experience of Oakland in this tool. So to save you the nitty-gritty, let's go straight to the results of this tool. We did 2 waterfall graphics. These are the graphics that show how you get to these deep reductions. It starts with the existing emissions on the left, your 2030 goal on the right. We have another one for 2050 on the following slide. And this shows by category where we get the most emissions reduction potential. This doesn't show the cost. This only shows the emissions reduction. Specifically, our top 3 categories are all transportation related in Oakland. The buildings are very important, especially when we start to look at 2050. We can't get to our goals without the buildings. Getting to the transportation matters more in a place like Oakland. And this is in part because of our very temperate climate. We have very low heating and cooling demands relative to other cities, but we also have a huge number of cars in Oakland and a significant problem with our emissions. So electrifying the vehicle fleet, getting efficiency, and getting people out of single occupant vehicles are by far our most impactful strategies over the next 12 years. When we get towards 2050, one of our transportation ones, efficiency goes out. Cars won't get significantly more efficient between 2030 and 2050 based on what we see coming from the marketplace. But mode shift and electrification still are the top 2 categories by a lot. The buildings cumulatively matter in this. And I should say to generate this data, one of the most fascinating parts of this process is that we exposed a lot of data points that we did not have. So we convened all the stakeholders within the building professions in Oakland. We brought in everybody who we thought knew what homes looked like. We asked contractors to come in. We asked the U.S. Green Building Council to come in. We asked regional providers, code enforcement officials, anybody who we thought would have knowledge of the buildings, and asked them legitimately, what do Oakland buildings look like? How many walls in old houses are uninsulated? The answer in Oakland, 91%. 91% of single-family homes do not have wall insulation, because that's how many were built before the adoption of the first energy standards in the mid-'70s. That changes how you're going to look at how the buildings operate. And for instance, when we did, we ended up mapping it out. And this is where you start to get into the cost effectiveness on this. We looked at it by technology. You're seeing lighting, appliances, space heating, water heating, cooling, building envelope for this. The green boxes mean that we don't really need to do a lot. The market is going to fix that on its own. The yellow requires some action. The red requires deep action. And if you see a bold box around the edge, it requires deep action and it's impactful. You notice that water heating and space heating are both red for Oakland, but we only have boxes around space heating because things like the insulation that I just mentioned goes into the fact that our buildings are estimated to use 6 times more natural gas in space heating than they are in water heating. State average is about 50-50. That told us that we were relying on old information that wasn't terribly accurate for Oakland when we applied it at the local level. We would have done heat pump water heater retrofits just as fast as space heating. In fact, we would have done water heating first and foremost because the technology is more robust, it's cheaper, it gets changed out more frequently. We would have done those things. The model told us, nope, wrong focus. Don't worry about water heating, worry about space heating. That's how you're going to get to the deep carbon reductions. And specifically, to your point earlier, how do you get to things deeply? Laura, you mentioned we've got 11 years according to the IPCC report. We've got to get real action by 2030. Your TAC came up with a lot of great ideas, and I don't think that you're going to repurpose half of the staff at all of your agencies to work just on these issues. They have other priorities and they have other needs. Absent a big fundamental shift in who's doing all the solutions, you've got to find a way to prioritize based on where you get real impact at depth. That's what this tool is doing for us, is it showed us what do we prioritize, what do we focus on. There's a lot of great ideas that have value and support. What they don't have is capacity. This tells us where to spend the capacity most meaningfully. So, the results of the model, 5 simple things. We broke them down into categories. And this is the basis of what I'm going to get to about what we do with this data. Shift to 100% carbon-free electricity. That's not a big surprise. That one was about the most no-brainer of this. We're using community choice energy in the East Bay because we don't have a SMUD. Come on, Arlen, come all the way out to Oakland. But absent that, CCAs are a very aggressive way that we can get to 100% clean energy quickly. Number 2 and 3 are related to that space heating problem that I identified. We focus on space heating, eliminate fossil fuel from heating systems, and improve building insulation and windows. So we were spending more time on very costly retrofit strategies for insulation because it matters more, because we have to get the gas use down in space heating, get the systems over to heat pumps as quickly as possible, or in case of commercial buildings, other technologies like VRF. But we have to focus almost entirely on space heating within the buildings in the short term. And then on the transportation side, shift people out of private automobile trips and accelerate the electrification of all the vehicles. This is all fairly standardized stuff within there, but there's a lot of ideas in transportation. There's a lot of low carbon mode shift going on. Is this scooters? Is this e-bikes? Is this Uber and Lyft and TNC style solutions? Is this changing the nature of transit and what transit is? For the transportation conversation, we had Uber and Lyft in the room with Ford Go Bike and Tesla and Caltrans and everybody we had in the innovation sector of all this. And we asked them detailed questions about how to do this. And the answers they told us really floored us for our expectations of what the market would take care of on its own. We thought we'd say, how do we get TNCs? How do you get Uber and Lyft to drive electric vehicles? They said, don't worry about it. When they're electric and autonomous, they will all be there. It will do it on its own. You won't have to do a thing. Uber and Lyft both said that they will switch to a fleet model for these of autonomous electric vehicles all at once. It will be the steepest hockey curve of technology adoption of anything we looked at within a sector. So the idea was, oh gosh, if they do that, do we have the charging infrastructure to handle it? What does charging infrastructure look like if there are 10,000 TNCs in Oakland, all at once electric and autonomous? Do we need to convert whole parking lots to electric? Do we really need to bother with curbside? Are they going to want to do curbside? These are now the type of questions we're having. So they're different, they're more refined, and we hope they're more strategic. And the way it relates back, when you look at the cost effectiveness and the total emissions output, this, Lori, gets to your point of how do you get there faster. We knew the state had their goal of 40% reduction by 2030. Everybody said that was ambitious. Our model showed that we can get to 56% at the levels that Council is funding climate action today. We can do that with the technologies that are going to be there. We can do that with the investment levels the way they are today. 56% by 2030. So we could potentially go higher than this. This is just the starting point. And we took all of this information to come full circle on this. I started out by telling you that everything in climate action is equity driven in a place like Oakland. Our community members, our council policymakers needed to have this information to have a true equity discussion. So we're updating our climate action plan right now as well in the city of Oakland. They all have the CURB report. They all have the details of all of this. And now the question isn't, what does everybody want to see? The question is, we know we need these 5 things. How do we do it in a specific way? How do we do it that prioritizes disadvantaged communities and the impacts that they face on a broad array of social conditions that are completely unrelated to climate? How do we do this in a way that maximizes where the benefits go to the populations that need it the most or are most impacted by climate change? Previously, we ended up with 175 actions because we had a really robust engagement process. To Robert's point, we talked to a lot of people. We asked open-ended questions, and we ended up with 175 actions that some things had negative carbon value. We were promoting local urban agriculture that was carbon negative. California grew lots of that same food, and they moved it by transportation in bulk. It had really low emissions. Growing it locally actually created more on that. This shows us a way that we think, have more articulate and thoughtful conversations with our community and better inform our policymakers of how we get to the equity outcomes that they have directed us as staff to do. And so we hope the outcome of that so far. We can get into the details of what that looks like. In the case of Oakland, nobody trusts staff to have those conversations. The city of Oakland has lost its privilege of being able to facilitate those type of community conversations. So our climate action plan engagement is led by the community. The Oakland Climate Action Coalition is a consortium of nonprofits that do resilience, they do food security, they do anti-displacement and housing, they do a number of things. We simply handed them money and said, what do you need from us? They dictate where the meetings are, when they happen, what the content matter is. They summarize all of it, they present it to the council makers, and then they decide if the plan actually includes equity as defined by the community. We took a very radical step in taking this information and putting it out to the community by taking ourselves out of the process. Whether this works or is the worst idea ever, we will come back and tell you in a year. But in the meantime, it's part of that really foundational shift in getting people engaged in climate in a more meaningful way than they have in the past. We think by taking ourselves out of the equation, we'll learn a lot of things, and we're in the process of finding out if that's true. But in the meantime, this is the strategy we're basing it on. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for all your leadership on this. Okay, now we'll do clarifying questions of Daniel. Hello.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I think you added a lot of structure to what some of our burgeoning questions were, so thank you for coming here and for doing this. I would like to know a little bit more about what this equity piece looks like and what you all are doing, because that was the whole time you were talking. I was like, great, now tell me about the equity frame, because that's what I'm really interested in. That's why I'm here, full disclosure. So I want to know how we do this in a way that prioritizes communities that have been historically subjugated and marginalized, and how we make sure that this does not become, I'm reminded of this, I think it was I don't know if it was Comedy Central or something, but this joke about how, somebody wanted to put their heir in somebody else's name. And I just don't want to ever get to the place where we are talking about who we're allocating our allocation of oxygen to. So that's really where the frame that I'm coming from is, how do we do this in a way that is equitable? And so what have you learned already from Oakland that we could potentially use here in terms of how to figure out how to do this in an equitable way?
Thank you for starting the questions with equity. I prefer to talk mostly about equity. The technology issue is, as Obadiah mentioned, the technology is actually out there.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of how we scale and how we get it and how we structure it in important ways. The equity part is not solved. While we're still doing it with the results of the CURB report, so I can't speak too much to that, I can tell you we've learned some pretty valuable lessons on equity in the deployment of some of our earlier models and approaches to this. A great one is sea level rise. Climate adaptation is a huge need here in the Sacramento region within this. Oakland sea level rise is of particular concern. We have a lot of coastline in Oakland, a lot of low-lying communities. Specifically, our waterfront is industrial in nature, and immediately inland from that are our low-income communities. So those are the most vulnerable to sea level rise. When we set out to do a sea level rise roadmap to identify that, we brought in the Bay Conservation Development Commission, we brought in the San Francisco Estuary Institute, we had PhDs from Berkeley, and we had lots of great science going into it, and we got the draft of the report, and then we stopped and said, wait a minute, we don't have anybody from the communities actually telling us what they think about sea level rise. Maybe there's something here. So we stopped our process. We went back and reconvened that same group with a lot of the community groups. And the first thing some of the West Oakland residents told us is, this is wrong. We asked why. And they said, you don't understand sea level rise until you understand on-the-ground conditions in our neighborhoods. And we said, great, explain them to us. What does that mean? And she said, in West Oakland, you're counting on the storm drainage outfalls to still be taking away most of this water. But yet illegal dumping in Oakland happens primarily in the low-lying areas where the storm drains are. They're regularly blocked by couches and debris piles and the rest. You're not picking up on the fact that in West Oakland, the drainage will be much slower than your models are going to anticipate. And we said, yep, that's probably right. So how do we adjust for the modeling of that? She said, oh no, I'm not done. Again, putting us in our place where we typically need to be put in these conversations. Secondly, she said, most of West Oakland has industrial property between the neighborhoods and the water. It's going to pick up anything that's in those soils and it's going to bring them to our areas. So you're talking about how to mitigate sea level rise. You're worried about what happens when our basements flood. I'm not worried about the water in the basement. I'm worried about the heavy metals that are getting picked up from the soils and brought in. This needs to be a toxics question. Your strategy needs to be based in environmental health, and county environmental health should be at the rim because of that. And the more we did that, the more we went to East Oakland and learned about the concerns of lead in the soil from lead-based paints. Our Fruitvale neighborhood of Oakland has higher childhood levels of blood-based lead than Flint. That's a reality of being on the ground in East Oakland. Okay. West Oakland has asthma rates in the 90s that were 16 times higher than the national average because their borders were freeway, fifth largest port in the United States, and the center point was a regional wastewater treatment plant. On-the-ground conditions really matter, and the people who live in those neighborhoods know those conditions better than anybody else. So when it comes to electric vehicle infrastructure, when it comes to changes in transit patterns, when it comes to where you put the parks and whether you plant a bunch of trees for carbon sequestration or keep them open because they're the only place for recreation in some of those neighborhoods. These are questions that the people on the ground in those neighborhoods are going to be able to answer far more impactfully than anybody else. And what we've learned most in the equity questions is to question our assumptions and never go very far down even an analysis route without talking to the neighborhoods that are going to be impacted. We're getting better at this. We're not great at it yet, but I think we're at least farther along than we were a few years ago. And the more we do this, the more we learn how to ask questions in ways that the feedback to the community generates better data for us. Our community has been very tolerant of us to this date, in that they've inserted themselves in bureaucracy. They've negotiated our own processes that are very difficult to understand for most community members. Now we're in the process of trying to change those to reflect more of the community's needs. This was the basis for hiring the community groups to do our climate outreach on this, rather than say, we want you to have 16 meetings in these locations, have them on weeknights, so the city staff, when they're done with their day, can go in and lead these at night. They said, no, you tell us. They said, every meeting is on a Saturday. You don't get to have them on weekdays anymore. Regular people go to work and then they come home and they take care of their kids. They're not going to show up then. They can bring their kids on the weekends, and you're going to bring them, and you're going to provide childcare. And you're going to provide food for everybody, and you're going to provide stipends for community members to go out and talk to their neighbors. And they can't be anybody from a climate organization. You can't hire the existing advocates to go out and talk, because they'll talk to other advocates. You go out and you hire people that work for the local church, that work for the local, any of the local organizations that appeal at a neighborhood level. Community centers, rec centers, these are the staff we went after to hire those on a neighborhood basis. So these are a couple of them. I'm happy to get into more details, but we've learned a lot. This is just a small intro of it.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Arlen, I feel like we're moving into the deeper discussion, which is great, so let's not worry about whether we're clarifying or not. And if you have questions for Obadiah, we can call him back up as well. Arlen?
Great, thank you. Daniel, thank you. Great report, and I like the focus on figuring out how we pay for it and the prioritization. I think that's going to be crucial as we move forward. I note in your presentation that the city spent about $160 million out of a $200+ million budget to achieve some of these goals. And have you been able to, in your mind, effectively track the carbon reduction, and has that expenditure tracked what you expected from a carbon reduction standpoint?
Yeah. Good question. We applied that analysis for the funding and financing after the fact. So the strategy wasn't based on a particular reduction by dollar invested, because we didn't know either of those things when we adopted the plan. We do greenhouse gas emissions inventories every 2 years. So we're able to track overall progress. We cannot track them back to individual sources. We can do them by general category, land use, energy, transportation, waste, and the like. We don't have a mechanism for doing ongoing tracking to show if things are working out the way CURB suggests that they will. The best we can do is show the overall picture right now. That being said, we've expressed to some of the philanthropic partners that that would be a very useful tool for things like CURB or Siemens, who also make tools like this, moving forward. But that being said, the caveat I'll put to that is that our council does use the reports to help guide policy. Oakland adopts a lot of climate-specific policies within that, and our emissions inventory is twofold. We adopt a core emissions inventory, which is what you heard about from your TAC, which is the standard way cities look at it. Draw a line around our boundaries, count up all the molecules of GHGs, equate them to CO2, and we give you a number at the end. We do that, but we also do a consumption emissions inventory in Oakland. 4 or 5 other cities in California do this, about a dozen in Oregon. Most of British Columbia does this at this point. They look at all the emissions that people who live in your community are responsible for. That opens up an entirely different realm of policy options when you consider that this is a global challenge and you want to have the most impact. Things like plastics won't show up in your emissions inventory at all. They're all made from fossil fuels. Does fossil fuel free mean no plastics in your community? If you're tracking this just by looking at local greenhouse gases, you won't capture those things. But you will be able to capture them in a consumption analysis. The methodology isn't nearly as good. It's not robust enough to track real progress on at this point. But there's a lot of movement in this if we're looking at it, especially from a policy perspective. The fact that you're all here talking about this as a region is far better than the Bay Area at this. And that's important to recognize, that the Bay Area can't convene something like this and meaningfully act together. and I think it's a great step within that, but consumption-based approaches lend themselves particularly good to this regional approach, whether it's banning plastic straws and stirrers because they end up as the most common form of litter within your illegal dumping piles, or other things that operate more where the emissions are happening outside of your community, but it's the people living here that are responsible for them. You can have a great deal of impact beyond just what happens in the buildings in the local energy system. I think Obadiah mentioned specifically some of the things like the natural gas methane leakage is a great example of one of those. Your natural gas leakage is happening many states beyond just where you're using it because of where you're buying the gas from, and that transmission distribution system is national within there. So I urge you to keep that in the back of your mind as you think about this, that doing that parallel analysis, it's not actually a huge adder to it. It's some different methodology, but it's published by a lot of communities at this point to share, and it opens up a lot of potential options for understanding where you can do things very cost effectively and where you can get bang for the buck beyond just your local emissions analysis.
Thanks. Julia?
Thank you very much for your presentation. Very inspiring when we start hearing the difficulties in implementation. I would ask that you act as a reference for us to be the next Bloomberg City. And I was hoping to say that before Steve left, because I think our council members on this committee need to get us in the queue. But I have a specific question on the curb analysis, which I think we absolutely need to do here in Sacramento. And that is, when you were doing that, did you pick different percentages of GHG reduction and estimate the cost? So did you do a 30% analysis and a 50% analysis and then come to some sort of recommendation to your governing body to say, we think we can do this, or we can stretch it with some public-private financing or Bloomberg money or whatever that was? Or did you just, okay, go ahead.
No, we did. And this gets to Steve's question about whether or not the TAC can get to that level, and it sounds like Sacramento, as part of the CAP, is looking into that. Ours is specific down to the measure, the impact of greenhouse gases estimated based on the changing, if there's renewable diesel thrown in or renewable natural gas thrown into the gas supply, if our grid electricity transitions to 100% clean by 2025, which is what our community choice energy programs had. We track those over time. So yes, we have them by technology measure with cost, so we can do cost effectiveness by measure all the way down from light bulb types to installing EV chargers. We've got it for every measure in the report and then aggregated up by category. So yes, we do have targets, but the targets are based on where the model said we could realistically go. They weren't set up as we can probably get to 30%, we can probably get to 35, which the experts coming up with those are often very close to what technology says you can get to, but ours was a technology-driven approach to set those numbers rather than vice versa.
Thank you. And I just have one more question on political will and mapping that. So did you also look at measures where you knew you had support for a decision being made? And one example that we can use now, back to the accessibility question, is when Governor Newsom says he wants to see age-friendly communities, then the question for second units not only becomes young millennials living in a housing like Nikki's building, but it's also, can we build my mother's second unit in my backyard? And looking at those kind of alternatives that may have support top-down from a governor saying we want to be age-friendly, bottom-up from financing and other ways to make those things happen.
The short answer is the model does not. The model simply tells us where the most potential is and what's most cost effective, whether it is politically viable or whether we can find an equitable strategy to do it. Those are open questions that we hope the engagement process and council's consideration will reveal. Time of use ordinance, we know that's impactful. Whether it has the political will, we don't know. Our council hasn't debated that yet. And this model doesn't help inform that. It only gives them some background for that consideration.
Thanks, Julia. Others? Chris?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Am I on?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. And it was very enlightening from an ability to kind of understand how one community prioritized and your journey there. And I think that was one of the challenges in reading through the recommendations. And I didn't have a chance to comment on the tax work because it was a very full list of ideas that were available to us to understand kind of the scope. But that was one of my concerns coming in, was how do we manage as policymakers on West Sacramento and Sacramento, folks that will be tasked to implement some of this. That will be one of the challenges with the community. So I'm interested in how you use the curb analysis, communicating to the community and kind of the outcomes. And is there an understanding in the community now about, more clear about priorities and how you will go about going forward with impacting climate change and sustainability in your community? That's one question I have. And the second one has to do with your role and sort of understanding organizationally how organizational effectiveness might come into a city being able to manage not just sustainability from a climate change perspective as the issue of equity in terms of how do you ingrain that in an organization, and are you tied to the planning and permitting process and being able to review ongoing policies going forward? There's kind of two questions in the back of my mind about how you operate in Oakland, if you don't mind sharing those, if you have an opinion on those.
Not at all. I think my answer to the first question would be anecdotal. I don't have good data to support this, but I would say, and I don't think this will come as a surprise to anybody, if we do this really well and we're robust about it, we'll get a public understanding of what those top 5 priorities mean. We'll get it from maybe 2% of the public understanding what we're talking about to maybe 3 or 4% of the public understanding what we're talking about. The way we measure success in government for public engagement is we've set the bar really, really low on this. If we have a council meeting here and you get 100 people to show up out of the 440,000 people that live in Sacramento, you consider that you've done well within this. Most people, their lives aren't touched. Their lives are touched by climate, but they don't understand the ways that we're talking about here. We're doing this at a very deep level. So I'd say no, we are nowhere close to having an informed populace about the details of this. I'd love for there to be more tools available for us, but no, our community groups do a lot more than the city does for educating the public, but even they really focus this message more on how do you keep anti-displacement going in these vulnerable neighborhoods? How do you reduce the environmental burden? How do you reduce the energy cost burden? For instance, we never talk about clean energy on its own. We talk about how to lower people's bills through clean energy. And it's the same messaging SMUD's been using for a very long time. In fact, I learned this at SMUD, so I'll give Arlen credit here. But I'd say we're still very far behind. But in terms of your second question, which I think may offer more relevant advice here, I spend most of my time dealing with mayor, council members, department heads on showing them where they can accomplish their strategies most effectively by doing climate-friendly solutions. So within the government itself, I focus mostly on getting those in charge of the departments to act in ways that are in their own self-interest. I just have to explain to them how that is. I can be an effective change agent there. In terms of informing the community and some of our regional partners, we do a lot of work with our school districts and the like. I am almost never in front of that. And this is something that I hope resonates with all of you. I am a privileged white male. I do not have legitimacy to lead that conversation in the city of Oakland. Period. I am not born in Oakland. I was not raised in Oakland. And as a relatively affluent white male, I do not have authority to lead that kind of conversation. I can help empower others to do so, and I can help provide people information that does it in a meaningful and authentic way. But an authentic way to engage the community is not to have somebody who's not seen as somebody really working for you, somebody who represents who and where you are. In Oakland, these are neighborhood scale conversations. Individual neighborhood. West Oakland is 6 neighborhoods. East Oakland is 17 neighborhoods. So it's down to the local level of these 300 homes. Who do they respect? Who do they know? I help those people have these kind of conversations, and I work a lot more behind the scenes than my team does for those kind of conversations, as well as with students. We prefer to have other students lead those conversations, and we find ways to train and lead them. Within that, I can be a better change agent within government, because as a fellow bureaucrat, people respect other bureaucrats, but within the community, it's a very intentional strategy for me not to be a face to that and to find ways to empower the community. And quite frankly, we get more trained advocates out of this. We get more people out there leading the message regardless of whether we're involved or not moving forward after we do that, if we do it well. If we do it poorly, they come back and yell at council about us.
Thank you.
Chris, on the curb analysis, I think we're probably all sitting here thinking, oh, we need to get that done, or something similar. But so what we'll do is we'll go back to, I think that would be up to the city and their consultant. So we'll go back, won't put you on the spot right now, and talk to them about whether they have the ability and resources to do that, and we'll bring that back to the commission and talk about that.
And you all have my contact information. I've given Kate and her team already the full curb reports within that, but the tool itself is free and downloadable. It's Googleable to get to, but I'm happy to send all the Oakland files to whoever's interested, so I will also send those to the LGC for distribution for everybody who's interested here.
Great, and I think we'll send the slides out to the commissioners after the meeting, too. Other questions for Daniel? It looks like he's about to leave. Lori?
I guess this is just a personal question, because it sounds like you're doing some amazing work and very aware of your community. But at the same time, you understand that that 11 years, which is probably a little optimistic. Personally, what do you think we should be doing to speed up? There was a lot of discussion about the costs and being practical and balancing things. But if we have a deadline that's, say, 10 years, a decade to turn things around, what is your personal feeling about how we can speed things up and actually get people to start thinking transformatively outside of their comfort zone?
I think if I got the answer to that question right, they would give me a Goldman Prize. It's complex. It's certainly, I don't think there is a clear pathway forward. From Sacramento, when I left Sacramento and went to the East Bay, the biggest thing I noticed is I don't have SMUD anymore. SMUD is such an amazing resource for this community, not just in the sense that it's a public power provider that has cheaper electricity than almost anybody in California. That's wonderful, it does. But because the board of SMUD has consistently supported deeper incentive levels than almost anybody else has for getting to transformation. So when you ask what you can do, I think West Sacramento and really all of the region should get together and decide what your top couple of priorities are. That list from the TAC was a beautiful, wonderful list of all impactful things. If you try to do all of them, I don't think you'll get very deep. I think you should decide, based on whatever criteria you think are most appropriate, you should decide which ones you want to go deep and fast in, and you should work with Arlen and his team to figure out how to do the boldest things related to those. And I'm not trying to put this all on SMUD. SMUD's not the only incentive provider, nor should they be responsible for this. This is going to involve a lot of stakeholders, cities, regional agencies, private sector will all have roles in this. But I think that you should target what you think is going to be most impactful and try to go deeper, faster, in what's meaningful to Sacramentans. And that may be the thing with the most greenhouse gas emissions reduction, or it may be things that have good greenhouse gas reductions, but that resonate with your people. For instance, in Oakland, sea level rise is a very easy thing to see. King tides already come up over the seawalls in Jack London Square and flood out areas. We've got neighborhoods that don't need us to show them what mapping looks like. It's an easy entry point for us to talk about what we can do there because it resonates with people already. People are terrified of wildfires in Oakland because of the Oakland Hills fire in the early 90s. This is an easy way for us to talk about climate adaptation and things we can do around carbon sequestration in the hills to strengthen the trees to make them more resistant to fire. These are the kind of conversations we can have. They're opportunistic. I think Sacramentans also have very strong opinions about the levees within the system, within some of the vulnerabilities that Sacramento has, but also some of the things that make Sacramento great. The tree canopy coverage, for instance. I was surprised to hear it's only 17% is the baseline. I've never lived in a place that had as many lovely trees as when I lived in Sacramento, and my tree canopy coverage is actually higher than that. My canopy coverage in Oakland is 27%. But you say that and you're impressed. You should actually be dismayed. You should be dismayed because 27% is actually 51% tree canopy coverage in the affluent hillsides of Oakland and 4% in the flatlands. Come to Oakland, it's very easy to see. The hillsides are lush and green and wonderful and verdant, and the flatlands suffer from urban heat island effect, lack of safety issues, and just unfriendly places for people to walk. There's a lot of inequity in a lot of these stories buried in there, and I think equity is probably the place where you'll find the things that matter most to Sacramentans and West Sacramentans and everybody in the region. I'd say focus on coming out with clear prioritization from this and really try to be impactful and show people that you can be successful at this and then move on to the next steps, but get some wins.
Okay, thank you so much for being here. It was a fantastic conversation.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
What I want to do now is hear from the folks that are here representing the commissioners that weren't able to make it. So the three of you, I'll ask you to come up and just give brief comment on the TAC recommendations that your commissioners would make if they were here. So Casey, why don't we start with you? Casey's from SACOG. Casey Lizon.
Good evening, Chair and Commissioners. I'm very happy to be here to speak on behalf of SACOG and for James Corliss, who would really like to be here but is, alas, in DC. We appreciate the thoughtfulness that went into the development of the recommendations from the Built Environment TAC. They were very creative in putting all possible solutions on the table, and I was able to attend one of those TACs, so I can attest to that. There was a lot of good, really difficult thinking that went into that, and a very, very well-structured process to get you the recommendations that you have. I think you're now looking at the next stage, and I actually really appreciated the presentation that Daniel gave, because he put into statements the questions that I wanted to pose to you for the next steps of this. So I will repeat only because I think they're very important. The next step, I think, is really, are the milestones the right ones? Which ones are too ambitious? Which ones are not ambitious enough? There are some similar strategies in here. So one of the next steps is to consolidate and simplify. I think how few strategies you can put forth ultimately will help you to be focused in implementation. The message about cost effectiveness, I think, was very important. I think cost effectiveness is also not just how much bang for the buck do you get, but what are the other consequences of those changes that you make with those costs that you either put onto someone to do or take on yourself. There are some city-focused solutions and there are some regional-focused solutions in the recommendations, and I would say this is something that needs to be thought through. What does that mean for this commission of 2 cities to have some city-focused recommendations, but then others that are for the region? So what does that look like? How would you move forth with implementing some of those? How would you build those partnerships? I think that how you implement these strategies and with incentives as much as possible, as opposed to, or taking regulations and thinking how you pair them with incentives, I think is going to be very, very important. When you think about, let's take, for example, older buildings. Older commercial buildings are the places where you actually have a lot of small business and you have business incubation. And so we have to think about what is the trade-off of putting requirements on that may ultimately be a burden for those smaller businesses that are renting in those places over time. And then lastly, I want to just keep emphasizing that any recommendations we have need to be really integrated land use and transportation solutions. So I really did appreciate that the built environment was a topic that came forth first, because I think that so many of the things that we are trying to accomplish, I'll even say for my organization, which is a regional transportation planning organization, we often look to smart and efficient and sustainable land use in order to be able to propose and help to deliver the transportation solutions that give people access to the places they want to go. So I'd say, even as you move forward with the Built Environment TAC, that and its recommendations, that those will need to be really carefully synced with the mobility recommendations, because one cannot happen without the other. So with that, thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Casey. Okay, Shelley Jang from the Air Quality District.
Good evening, Chair and Commission members. I'm Shelley Jang, here to represent the Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District. Thank you for the opportunity to share the thoughts of Alberto Ayala, who is sorry that he cannot make it here today. The Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District fully supports the recommendations of the Built Environment Technical Advisory Committee. We would also like to thank the committee members and the local government commission staff for their hard work in developing these recommendations. In our comments, we'd like to highlight several strategies out of the many that we believe will lead the way towards carbon zero by 2045. First and foremost, adopting smart, compact land use patterns is a foundational strategy towards going carbon neutral. Compact land use and infill development may be, in fact, the closest thing we have to a silver bullet for climate change, as it helps to achieve multiple regional priorities: reducing greenhouse gas reductions from transportation, arresting the growth in vehicle miles traveled, providing carbon-free mobility choices, building vibrant, walkable, and socially cohesive communities, and improving air quality and health. As a region, we are currently falling behind in meeting our air quality and vehicle miles traveled goals, and without a transformation in our land use patterns, it will be all the more difficult to reduce transportation greenhouse gas emissions. An increase in green space in the urban tree canopy is also critical for our region, as extreme heat is one of Sacramento's key impacts from climate change. Green spaces and a healthy urban forest canopy can help improve air quality, sequester carbon, absorb stormwater, and reduce the urban heat island effect, making them win-win strategies for adaptation and mitigation. The Sacramento Air District and the Local Government Commission are currently leading a project to identify urban heat islands in our region and develop mitigation recommendations that we will share with all the jurisdictions in the Sacramento region when we are complete. And as we move forward towards fossil-free new construction, we applaud the inclusion of electric vehicle charging in commercial and multifamily buildings. But we would also like to be mindful of the growing promise of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and the importance of staying technology neutral. With their near instantaneous refueling time and long range, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles can appeal to a different market segment, especially for heavy-duty and off-road applications. To successfully help existing residential buildings to go all-electric, selecting the right sufficient incentives and more marketing and education will also be important. And we also need to look at how new roads and commercial land uses can further help increase induced demand for transportation. Finally, we also welcome the request of Mayor Steve Lee to join the Mayor's Commission on Climate Change. We live, work, and play as a region, and not as jurisdictions alone. The shared development and implementation of climate strategies will be integral to their success. A multi-jurisdictional regional vision of carbon zero will be more robust and reduce the likelihood of businesses and housing shifting to other cities. We would also like to finally emphasize the need to be bold and aggressive in moving forward. The best time to act on climate change was 20 years ago, but the second best time to act is now. We encourage the Commission to prioritize anything we can act on and implement immediately. As tens of thousands of children reminded us during the youth climate strikes last Friday, there is no gray area when it comes to survival. There is no less bad option. We can't wait any longer. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. Okay, this is Chris Flores from RT.
With Sacramento Regional Transit. I'll be brief and I'll let you guys get to your discussion, but I do want to take the opportunity to say a few words. As we heard from Casey earlier, the integration of transit and the built environment are directly linked. Virtually every passenger on a transit ride is a pedestrian at some point. So their access to transit, their proximity to transit, those are all important. So as you guys formulate and look at future suggestions and adoptions, I think big, how can we be impactful with the decisions we make, and then also echoing the conversation of how we get there with the funding that really can help us move it over the top. So thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Helena, can you give me a sense of how many? I just asked. Oh, 10, okay. I was asking about public comment. Okay, thank you. Same wavelength. Okay, so now we can open it up for further discussion, and I feel like perhaps the most important thing is to really formulate what we want to ask the TAC to do going forward. They're going to meet again. Yeah, Orlin?
I wonder, before we formulate what we want the TAC to do, if it would be helpful to hear from the public first and then have our conversation, just a suggestion.
Sure, I love it. Fantastic. Okay, we'll get those comment cards in now. Okay. Helena, we'll take those and then you can collect. Okay. Great, thank you. So as most of you probably know, we have a 2-minute time period for public comment, and Kate is going to run a clock that you'll see up on the screen. Okay, Gonzalo Castillo, and if when you come up, you could state your organization or affiliation, please.
Good evening, yes, Gonzalo Castillo. I'm affiliated with the Sacramento Climate Coalition, and I'm a member of a subcommittee for West Sacramento to implement a climate change emergency as well. My comments are more extensive than 2 minutes, so I provided written comments as well. I just want to emphasize the climate emergency and 2 documents that are well-known the IPCC report 2018, October 2018, that gave us a 12-year timeline to achieve not just neutral carbon emissions, but negative carbon emissions to avoid the 1.5 degrees Celsius increase that is considered to be the threshold for very dangerous climate changes and escalating impacts as well. The other report is one prepared by an organization in Europe that is referred to the negative emissions, and is also provided in the written comments the link to that document. There is a big need to develop negative carbon emission technologies because the Paris Agreement not only requires that we achieve carbon reductions in all the emissions, but also we sequester carbon dramatically from the atmosphere to levels that will prevent us from reaching that threshold. I have provided other additional comments, so I will
Great.
stop for now.
Thank you, and we'll be sure to distribute your comments to everybody. Matthew Piner?
Thank you, members of the commission. You have a very difficult and wicked problem ahead of you, as we all do. I was a member of the TAC, and I wanted to speak to one thing in particular, which was how to focus on the positive for the community. And the idea of the catalyzing community, the eco-villages, was really meant to be something that where people could go and really see positive visions of the future and what it looks like, that it doesn't have to be scary, that it can be delightful and exciting. Also provide places to educate people about what a future can look like. I'm going to leave it to others to and yield my time to the rest of the people on the list.
Thank you. Thanks for participating in the TAC. Brian Shobe or Shobe?
Good evening, Commission members. My name is Brian Shobe, and I'm a resident here in Sacramento. I'm here because I care about the health, safety, and future of this community. I'm inspired and supportive of all the recommendations the TAC has made thus far, though also agree with the suggestions for deeper dives into data and analyses. But I do want to see a faster timeline and see which of those recommendations could be ratcheted up, not just on the sort of 30 or 50% RET. I think one thing we heard tonight is that many of the solutions that will have to be implemented at the neighborhood level. And so I'd also encourage TACs, which I'll be a member of the third one, to also consider the implementation phase of these recommendations and which neighborhoods should be prioritized. But to do that and to have informed recommendations, I think it's not too, it's never too early to start to have meetings in the communities to inform those recommendations. So I would suggest to the Local Government Commission and the chair to consider a way to start those meetings now. They should be in different neighborhoods across the city, and there should also be a series of meetings after all of the recommendations have been created to gather feedback on those. I think other folks will have other process recommendations, but suffice to say, I think the implementation of this is ultimately what's most important, and so I'd also encourage the Commission to itself begin to think about its role in the oversight of the implementation and monitoring of these recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. About the community engagement, the city does have a plan as it develops its CAP, the City of Sacramento, for engagement. Could you, Remy, would that be okay to just make a quick comment on that? This is Remy Mendonça from the city.
Yes, good evening again, Chair and Commissioners. Remy Mendoza. As part of our general plan update and our climate action plan, this project was just initiated. It's a 24-month process, and we're 4 months into it. Over the next 20 months, over 3 phases, we will be engaging with the community at the citywide community plan and neighborhood level for both the general plan update and the climate action plan. The first phase of outreach will begin soon in late April. We will be hosting 3 citywide workshops, and more information will be out on those soon.
Okay, thank you very much. And I just would note there's also an opportunity to provide input on the LGC website.
Excellent. We'll be sure to do that.
Thanks. Okay, Brian, I'm not sure of your last name, Senert. Apologies.
Thank you, Commissioners, and good job on the name. Thank you for that. I'm an architect, also a member. I live in Midtown, Sacramento, and I was on the Environmental Building TAC. First of all, I do want to compliment Obadiah for getting what he did out of us in a very short period of time, and I want to make sure Arlen heard that as well. So. And Julia also for helping organize us. Taking no importance away from the land use and new construction, which is really what I usually deal with. Something the green building community has been very interested in, both architects and the Green Building Council. They've been trying to emphasize for over a decade that we need to attack existing buildings and really make improvements there. There's so much outdated equipment and systems that have to be replaced, and these antiquated systems are causing a serious problem, and unless we get at it, we're not going to make a dent in your goals. The difficulty is finding the equitable and fair ways to fund that, and that has been an issue for over a decade, and we really didn't have that much time to address that in our TAC, but I want you to know we're there to try to explore it further. We want to find ways to make a difference there. I'd simply like to urge you not to break apart or adopt individual requirements at this time, but rather take your experts' guidance and live with it for a while. Go through a process of due process where you can prioritize these recommendations, identify the low-hanging and high-hanging fruit, and further identify funding mechanisms and financial tools. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, our next 3 will be Karen Jock, Martha Turner, and Chris Brown.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Jacques. My first comments will be on behalf of Trees for Sacramento, and that is that a 25% canopy is way too low. I mean, people in the community that are concerned about trees and the benefits they provide are talking about we need to get closer to 40%. There's a tree master plan that's in the works. Even there, we haven't been talking about anything as low as 25%. And it needs to include both the planting of new trees, and in some of our poorest communities that are tree deprived, it needs to be done working with those neighborhoods and listening to exactly how they need to do it and what support they need. But it also means working with the development community. It is still incredibly easy to take out trees that have 30, 40 years and are providing tremendous benefits, and it's going on all the time, and it needs to stop. A lot of things can be redesigned to include trees and still get density. So that goal needs to expand. I want to say a couple of things on behalf of myself. I hope that even before all electric is in code, that the building departments will be encouraging new construction or major renovations to do all electric. It's much harder to have to go back in. And the last thing is a comment that there was comment made about plastics. And that's a huge source of fossil fuels, and our streets are littered, and looking at that is important. Thank you.
Thank you. Martha Turner. Nice to see you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm with Fossil Free California, and I wasn't planning on speaking, but there were 2 points that came up during the presentations I'd like to quickly bring up. One is I spent most of my day today over at CalPERS, and I would like to suggest, having observed CalPERS for approximately 6 years, that through considered discussion, which would be a possibility perhaps, that you may find some other opportunities for funding mechanisms and funding partnerships. And so I would encourage the TAC to consider that possibility. It would certainly be something that would have to be done in conjunction with something like the League of Cities or some other statewide entity that would be a partner with you in considering how legislation could be designed to allow that possibility of doing some sort of partnering for implementation. And that would probably be true also, I would guess, for your transportation as well, although I don't really know, and less so possibly with the Resiliency Committee, Health and Resilience. The other point, completely different, but spurred by Ms. Kofer's comments, I'd like to say that I had the opportunity in 2017 to attend the National Climate Adaptation Forum, and I was very inspired by many, many things that happened there. The outreach to the Native American community was over the top. It was the best I've ever seen, and I've worked in Washington State where I've worked with Native communities. So I would like to suggest that during that conference, the community outreach mechanisms that I observed for Detroit and Washington, D.C. were also very, very interesting. And they complemented well what we heard from the City of Oakland and Daniel today. So I'd just like to offer that up.
Thank you. Chris Brown?
Good evening. I applaud everybody's stamina. 3-hour plus meeting, I bet. So I'm representing the Sacramento Climate Coalition. I live here in Oak Park neighborhood. The first comment I want to make tonight is that the social, it has to do with the first 2 pages. The social cost of carbon is too low in this estimate. It's from a much earlier study. More recent studies have shown that it's about $100 a year, $100 a ton in 2015 and rising as we do not do enough to mitigate and adapt to what the changes we're making. We're underestimating the cost to ourselves. Carbon zero is the wrong target. We should be at 0 emissions by 2030 to follow the advice of scientists are giving us now. 0 fossil fuel emissions, which means our leader here, Arlen, you're going to need to shutter those natural gas plants by 2025. Another couple of comments to the contents. West-facing solar is mentioned, but not south-facing solar, and studies show that both are important for taking fossil fuels out of the equation. We need more investment in retrofits up front, especially in disadvantaged communities. They're lightly addressed in here, but that's a big investment, and it's really important to understand that rebates, which are mentioned clearly, are not going to work in low-income communities. You need to have direct install programs. And the current ones, it's very hard for a low-income person, I live in those neighborhoods, to figure out which contractor is really going to do you well. The agencies need to provide that guidance. The city needs to provide that guidance. Choose these people as the best for you. I like the eco-village recommendation. The demonstration project should actually be in every council district so that each neighborhood has a shining beacon of what the future looks like. And this goes for both cities and hopefully every city in our region as fast as possible. We start to look at what our future looks like.
You're at time. Thank you for your comments.
How about Matt Piner's extra time? Can I have yours?
Thank you.
He donated it. But the built environment, I'm going to just say this, the built environment includes our infrastructure, and water's not dealt with in here, as are not the paved, asphalt paved streets. It really does suggest to me that at some point we're going to have to wrap back around to some of the infrastructure issues that
Thank you.
have to do with the built environment.
Thanks, Chris. And remember, you can always submit online as well. Our next three speakers are Gia Wong Connolly, Steve Euler, and Bruce Burdick.
Good evening. My name is Jia Wang Connolly. I'm a structural engineer working for the state, and I also volunteer as the chair of a Planning and Design Commission with the City of Sacramento. But today, I'm here to speak to you as a mother of a 26-month little baby girl called Cypress. They say that you cannot spell carbon without cars. So the most important and impactful thing that we ought to do is to take people away from their cars. And that means density is destiny. That means we have to develop inward and upward and invest in the existing commercial corridors to connect all the folks from their house to the corridors to satisfy their daily need. And the bike share, it gives us the opportunity that we don't have before, and connect the corridors with efficient public transit. And that's the vision. Clearly, status quo is not working, otherwise you won't be here. So what's the missing link? We don't have a clear matrix to rank the development based on how much are they helping us or are they hurting us to achieve this goal. They should consider the siting, the location, and the parking ratio. Bottom line is this development encouraging us to drive more or drive less? And if it's a good project, the city ought to use all the resources to help them to fly through, including the entitlement by right. But if it's not, then the city ought to use the negative land use power. At the end of these 5 meetings, you're going to deliver to the mayors and citizens of the region a recommendation. I ask you to be bold and keep this in mind. We did not inherit the earth from our ancestor. We borrow it from our children. Thank you.
Thanks for your work on the Planning Commission. Just so commissioners know, Kate and I met with Ms. Wong Connolly recently, and we talked about the need going forward to figure out a way that the climate issues are incorporated into the Planning Commission's work, which is something the City Council would have to make a determination about, but possibly will be one of our recommendations. Steve Euler.
Yes, thank you, Chair and Commissioners. I want to talk about metrics. If you're going to have plans, you should have a good way to measure. You might think in terms of emitters, enablers, and the empowered. Emitters, emitting the carbon. Enablers are the ones that that do the offsetting for that carbon to be emitted. The empowered are all the things that you haven't talked about here tonight. Thing to think about if you're going to talk about zero is, and then in terms of net, is the net big enough? If everybody in the state does the same thing you do, can it be done? Last time I was here, I talked about power content label. SMUD still doesn't have a power content label. The commission hasn't approved one. Renewable portfolio standard period, second period, which was supposed to be 25% of total retail sales for the period. SMUD did 21.62%, and then also claimed some customer credits to offset in that. Come up with key performance indicators that are very visual. I would say instead of all these different graphs with bars and squares and whatever, select a Pareto chart. 80-20 rule type chart. You can look up Pareto and see the wisdom of using Pareto. Power source disclosure, that should be start talking greenhouse gases soon. There's disaggregated data that's going to be available. If you talk to the Energy Commission and say you want the 15-minute data for your area, you should be able to get it. I've given them a structure that will be anonymized that would allow you to have the data and be able to do better planning. And there's more. I'll put the rest of it on the site.
Thank you. Bruce Burdick.
My name's Bruce Burdick. Thank you for working on climate change. Sure appreciate it. I'm concerned about motivating people about to really take their driving seriously, and one way to do that might be to have the true price of gasoline listed at gas stations. If you Google the true price of gasoline, $15 a gallon, you'll see a video that 4 UC professors worked on. It seems to me you could ask one of those professors, which is UC Davis, Dan Sperling, to give an update. This was back in 2011 that it was $15 a gallon. Has that gone up at all with the fires and the other climate change problems we've been having? And then if this true price of gasoline were listed at gas stations right next to the price that the gas station is charging, people could begin to think, maybe we really need a fine on gasoline that could then go to negative emissions technologies. There are negative emissions technologies out there, like Professor Stuart Lick thinks that he can take CO2 out of the atmosphere with some lithium carbonate and electrodes. Also, I think Blue Earth has a way of taking CO2 out of emission stacks like at SMUD. Maybe SMUD could be thinking about making aggregate that is high in CO2. Anyway, Blue Earth has that, and maybe people know about that. Anyway, thank you for working on climate change.
Thank you very much. Okay. Our next 3 are Michael McCormick, Bonnie Jacobson, and Dawn Whitney. And just so people know, after that, we've got 10 or 12 more to go.
Good evening, Chair, Commissioners. Nice to be here tonight. Just wanted to thank a couple of people. I was on the Technical Advisory Committee, so had a great experience over the first couple of meetings. Unfortunately, I wasn't at the last one, but wanted to highlight a couple of things. Special thanks to Obadiah, who did, as some of the other speakers mentioned, did an amazing job of pulling us all together. To the Commission for allowing us to be creative and robust in our recommendations. To LGC for being a great partner. I'll get to that in a second. And then to staff as well, who, this is a heavy lift in a really short amount of time, and really appreciated. So I wear 2 hats. One is the chair of the board for the Cool Davis Foundation, and then as the division president for Harrison Associates. And a number of the things that came up during the TAC meeting were really meaningful, but a couple of them stuck out to me in particular. One is right after the goal of 2045, carbon neutrality was adopted. The City of Davis decided to adopt carbon neutrality by 2040. So congratulations for motivating deeper reductions across the region. And then cross-jurisdictional collaboration really seems to be one of the biggest points across all of the things that we talked about. We can't succeed as a jurisdiction in Sacramento without further and deep collaboration across the region. And one piece of that is preservation of farmland, the urban growth boundaries discussion and recommendation, and conservation easements. This has worked in Yolo County quite well. We also think that it would work very well here in Sacramento County. Locational efficiency is also a piece. One of the points on the Planning Commission connection, if you have a screen for locational efficiency, you can really tease out those projects that are quite efficient and those that aren't, and really prioritize those projects that are efficient as they move through the process. Want to thank Daniel Hamilton for coming as well. We've worked together for a very long time, and he's highlighted some really great work products that he's done over the years. But there's 2 major pieces to success. One is budget.
You're at time, so
And then the other one is
quick.
having a local NGO partner, like Local Government Commission, to make sure that that's successful on the ground. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Bonnie Jacobson?
I didn't intend to speak. I intended just to submit the comment.
Oh, I can address it if you prefer.
Oh, okay. Well, that's all right. In the past few years, I've been doing a lot of volunteer work with people at risk of homelessness and refugees, and these are people who don't typically have a vehicle. And I've become much more aware of how inadequate our public transportation system is. So what I didn't hear in any discussion today was targeting clean air, public transportation, and how we're going to improve the development and the access for that. Thank you.
Thank you. And perhaps we should have reiterated our process at the front, but we have 3 expert committees that are going to provide input to the commission. So today we heard from the Built Environment Expert Committee, and then after this meeting, a separate technical advisory committee on mobility will start meeting. It'll meet 4 times following the model of the last one. So I'm sure those issues will be taken up fully there. Thank you for your comment. Okay, did I call Don Whitney already? The next 3 are Don Whitney, Jackie Cole, and Tom Meager. Don here? Okay, perhaps Don is not here. You're Jackie? Jackie Cole, great.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners. First of all, I want to say thank you for all the hard work that was put in. Special thank you to Daniel, because I feel like he really highlighted some of the things that a lot of these conversations we've been trying to get down to, especially where equity specifically is involved. And I just wanted to kind of reiterate that communities are ready for this, underserved communities in particular. They've already been putting in a lot of the work and identifying the projects that can help us reach those goals. So it's really just about us providing the space and the resources to get those folks to the table to start providing some of that direction. And as long as we're talking about a community-led process, I just want to kind of reiterate as well that in terms of a long-term process, because this isn't going to be a finished process in the next 2 to 5 years realistically, but what we want to do is to establish relationships with those communities so that they can continue to provide ongoing support for the work that we're trying to accomplish. And then lastly, or not lastly, but anti-displacement and anti-gentrification were kind of mentioned in passing. And I also just want to say that that's a really huge issue in terms of the level of improvements that we're trying to bring to a lot of these communities. And where we're not able to provide that, we're actually just kind of accelerating gentrification. So providing safe and secure housing is a major issue as we're navigating that conversation. And then actually lastly, cross-sector TAC support. Equity is a foundation of all 3 of these TACs, and so it was lovely to hear once again how that needs to be a lens through which we're looking at the solutions as we're arriving there, but making sure that that the TACs are communicating effectively with each other, because it's a comprehensive level of solutions that we're looking for, and you can only get that when those groups are actually communicating with each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom Meager?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Let's see. I have already been at a few SMUD rate meetings, and I published a editorial in the News and Review January 24th on how the way the rate is structured has a significant impact on energy use and carbon emissions and the whole thing. Unfortunately, SMUD's current high fixed charge discourages conservation and solar, and it actually, in my opinion, forces low energy users to subsidize high energy users. For example, a small energy user who only uses a couple hundred kilowatts a month pays 20 to 30 cents a kilowatt hour. People who use a lot of energy, 1,000 kilowatt hours, are paying 12 to 13 cents. It's the opposite of the way the big utilities like PG&E, San Diego, and Southern Cal Edison do it. So the problem is at SMUD, it's like the opposite of a carbon tax. At SMUD, the more energy you burn, the less you pay per kilowatt hour. So my goal is to get that changed. So I've been sending some literature to the Sacramento or SMUD board members, and hopefully they'll read through it and see there's different ways to do the rate structure to give an incentive to conserve and use solar. And I think still have a little time left, but I think that's about all I had to say. So I guess the Built Environment Committee, maybe I'll provide you some of my data. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, our next three folks will be Dan Allison, John Eisen, and Justin Tweet.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Dan Allison, and I live in downtown Sacramento. The presentation by Mr. Hamilton was amazing, just eye-opening for me about the way to go about things. I have two comments about the land use section. The first, strategy number one, the regional or urban growth boundary, is a great idea, but it uses the phrase existing and already approved. We simply cannot go with already approved entitlements. There are entitlements that would just kill every effort that you make because it'll be sprawl development. We need to look at the entitlements and eliminate some of them. We can't have greenfield development. We're in a climate emergency. Greenfield doesn't work, and it needs to be taken out. I also think that all urbanized areas in Sacramento County, at least, should be either annexed or incorporated. The county has proved itself incapable of managing major change, incapable of managing urbanized areas, and the county could undo every single good effort of Sacramento and West Sacramento by continuing to encourage sprawl, which it has been doing. The third strategy relates to zoning. It's very vague. It acknowledges that we need to increase density, but it doesn't say any more than that, and I think that's a key item that needs to be amplified. And I'm curious about how the mobility TAC product and the built environment TAC product will be merged back together, because if they're freestanding, they don't work. So there needs to be a process and a plan for how to bring them back together in the final product. Thank you.
Thank you.
To the last comment, we will be rolling recommendations up from all three technical advisory committees. So the built environment, the mobility, and then the health and resilience. We'll also be having a business roundtable. So we'll be looking at the economic development impacts and potential funding and financing strategies as well. So that final report will be submitted to the commission and available to the public after we finish all three of the TACs.
Thanks, Kate. John Eisen? Maybe not. Justin Tweet, I saw you.
Thank you for your participation on the commission and helping our community to address this crisis. So while carbon neutrality by 2045 seems like it's very challenging, unfortunately it's not aggressive enough to stay below 2 degrees Celsius according to the best science. Much of the guidance that's provided to policymakers comes from the IPCC Working Group 3, which assumes large-scale negative emission technologies, thereby reducing the level of emission cuts required. The risk is if these highly speculative negative emission technologies aren't deployed on the scale assumed, which most scientists don't believe is possible, we're locked into a higher temperature pathway, which will get us well above 2 degrees. For a chance at 2 degrees without relying on these negative emission technologies, climate scientist Kevin Anderson indicates that wealthy countries like the US should cut their emissions by 15% per year and reach zero between 2035 and 40. And that's for 2 degrees, not 1.5. As we learned in our last Climate Commission meeting, there's a big difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. A second concern is how we measure progress. Previous climate action plans have set long-term targets, such as 2030 or 2050. These sorts of targets create little urgency to take action today. Since our emissions remain in the atmosphere for centuries, the amount of warming we experience is determined by cumulative emissions. we should set a carbon budget and adjust our remaining budget after each year, as was proposed by City Councilor in Vancouver, Christine Boyle. Vastly different worlds are possible at this point. If we are serious about limiting our temperature increase, we need to determine the target based on science, not politics, and hold ourselves accountable. Thanks.
Thank you. And our final three commenters are Kimmy Boyle, Kiran Kumar, and Mike McKeever.
There are others of us who have submitted comments.
Okay. Do you have their cards, Helena? Okay. Why don't we, are you Kimmy? Okay, we'll hear from you and then we'll sort this out afterwards. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kimmy Boyle. I'm just a citizen here in Sacramento who's just concerned about climate change and how it's going to affect us. So thank you guys for letting me have the moment to speak about it. I think this might be more appropriate for the Mobility Committee, but I really want to focus on trying to move away from just the encouragement of electric vehicles and trying to move away and think bigger picture and more towards the future about how can we get more people using public transit, how can we improve modes of transit for people in Sacramento to kind of adopt moving away from cars into viable solutions. So I know, for example, Sacramento RT is actually having something really cool, which is called Smart RT, which is where it's kind of like Uber and Lyft, but it's a lot more affordable, and they're doing that in other communities that don't have access to transportation. So I think looking into those kind of options and just trying to discourage people from just being like, all right, if we go to electric vehicles, we need charging stations. I feel like it could be a wasted investment. Just because if you're thinking really long-term future, that still means that people are having individual cars. You're not eliminating cars from the road. The other thing I wanted to mention, I thought the idea about eco-villages was really interesting, and kind of having more planned communities that include sustainable practices from the get-go. And so if you're going to be doing new development, I think that's a really good thing to implement from the beginning. I think communities like the Village Homes in Davis is actually a really great starting point to kind of getting ideas and like have a purposeful development. And then the last one is just about talking about like forcing people to upgrade to more environmentally friendly appliances and stuff. You're going to need to help support communities of lower incomes to be able to do that in a viable manner. So, thank you.
Great, thanks. Kiran Kumar, and I don't know what happened to your card, but of course you can speak, and we'll just take that after these next two speakers.
Good, actually, evening, members of the commission. My name is Kiran Kumar. I'm the executive director of Walk Sacramento, a regional active transportation and land use planning advocacy organization. Just a couple of quick points. I didn't plan to speak, but I was really inspired by the discussion and the presentation, so thank you. The first one is engagement and equity, and I love the point that you had made, Daniel, that there was an intentional effort in Oakland to not give the money and the onus of engagement to the enviros because we just talk to ourselves, and I tend to agree. We have a neighborhood structure, both in the city of West Sacramento and Sacramento, that we have to take advantage of. Folks who are working on income insecurity, housing, and education. So a quick anecdote, 27% of kids who are chronically absent in Sac City Unified School Districts are so because they don't have access to transportation. So there's a real clear connection there. Second one, prioritization is incredibly important. I think we all agree on that. At the same time, though, it's really unfortunate that the county isn't at the table here. To Dan's point about some of the entitled projects that will be pushing sprawl, we really need to be addressing that. Extremely supportive of the built environment recommendations. Glad to see that there is such an intentional effort to address mobility and not just electrification, but livability and mobility, getting folks out of their cars. And then finally, funding. We can't have a discussion about what's next without actually talking about the current levels of funding that we're actually contributing to these things, not to pick on the city of Sacramento, but because we have Oakland in the room. Despite having almost the same population size, we have a transportation budget a third of the size of Oakland. So to really get at our transformative land use transportation investments and strategies, we really need to think about the commitment of those local funds to address this stuff. So thank you.
Thank you. Ma'am, would you like to speak now?
Yeah, sorry, I can't walk up there right now, so I'll just speak extra loud.
We can hear you.
My name is Martha Nungesser.
Oh.
Ben, grab her hand, how if you search more.
Thanks, Flo.
My name is Martha Nungesser. I'll just speak loudly.
Check, check.
There we go. Thank you, Ephraim.
Amazing. My name is Martha Nungesser. I've worked in the past with the tree board in another city in Florida. I'm really interested in the whole idea of planting trees. I think it's a wonderful idea, and I was really glad to see that the TAC included that, including targets for the numbers of trees in different communities. One of the things I would strongly urge you all to consider is to require at least a majority of native tree species to be planted because they're much better adapted to the climate here. In addition, they should also be chosen based on what the future conditions are expected to be like within the lifetime of the trees, like 50 to 75 years, so that trees planted now young will be able to continue to grow and thrive in a changed and altered, maybe drier, hotter climate. Second thing is, and I don't know how this was worked in other cities, but I've heard other places recommending that in lower income neighborhoods that there be an option to plant fruit trees and nut trees so that the residents of the area will have access to good, healthy, very fresh produce, or fruit especially, and then the nuts maybe, but the fruit trees in particular. So I'm just hoping that that will become part of the TAC and or part of the future planning for trees planted in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike McKeever.
Mike McKeever here as a resident of the city of Sacramento, retired finally 2 years ago from SACOG, 2 months ago for Mayor Steinberg's staff. So I'm unplugged finally. I want to sincerely thank you for the great work that you're doing. The mayors gave you a very, very tough assignment, and it's really clear that you are on the case full on, and we all badly need you to succeed. I want to comment on the good work of the committee, focused on their first recommendation for a regional urban growth boundary. I witnessed the benefits of a regional urban growth boundary in metropolitan Portland, where I was for 2 decades. It is a very strong tool for accomplishing the goals that you're talking about here. What you may not know is that there's an existing tool in this region which can create many of the benefits of a regional urban growth boundary, and that, of course, is the Regional Metropolitan Transportation Plan and Sustainable Communities Strategy. These 2 cities, sitting with 26 other local government elected officials every 4 years under state and federal law, must adopt a combined Metropolitan Transportation Plan Sustainable Communities Strategy. What that is a collection of land use projects and a collection of transportation projects. To the extent that those 2 plans lean heavily on the types of infill that are recommended by your technical group and the types of transportation that support infill rather than sprawl, and active transportation and transit behavior as opposed to single occupant car behavior, you can get to these goals through that device. And so this is 2 ugly facts in the regional planning world in the state of California today, are that all of the regions empirically are underperforming in their VMT compared to what's in their plans. And the state Air Board has a new document that says they need to do much better in the future in terms of carbon and VMT reduction than now. And so this is in play right now, and these 2 cities have the capacity to to help make sure that a good plan gets adopted in about 9 months. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Okay, does anyone else wish to speak? I don't have any more cards. All right, I just want to thank yes? Please come on up. Could say your name and organization, please? Yes.
Hello, sorry I'm a little late. I'm Imani, I'm with Extinction Rebellion. And I just, sorry, yeah, I'm a little late and flustered, but I just graduated from studying environmental studies at San Francisco State University. And I won't, go into a lot of the details, as I'm sure a lot of you know, but I would just like to ask you all, I'm from hearing what's been being said, and I'm going to read up a little bit more, but I know you all are, probably doing what you can and working and understand that there's an issue, but you and climate scientists have been very clear we don't have the amount of time that a lot of you have put in the legislation. So I would just, from my studying and just also paying attention to what has been going on, I know that, 2025 is really where we need to be aiming for getting as close to net zero as possible. So, I don't want to take up any, go overtime. So I'll just say again, please, whatever you can do, just try to make it as soon and quick and swift as possible. And I would just like to second what the gentleman was saying, that especially after living in the Bay Area for a few years and coming back to Sac, I was born and raised in Sacramento, we really do need to focus on transit out here, because we know, being in California, being the capital of California, that transportation is a huge % of our fossil fuel use. And so, SAC RT, putting money into that is really necessary, because we basically live in a big suburb. I mean, our urban area in the city is very small. So 2025 for net zero, please. And SAC RT, just invest as much money into that as we can. Thank you all for what you're doing.
Thank you. Okay, anyone else? All right, everyone who spoke and everyone who's here, just thank you for being here and for your passion about the issues and for being part of this. Okay, commissioners, there's not that much time left. We have some questions on the screen, but I think that the third question is probably the most important one. We've heard so much today about what could go back to the TAC for consideration. I think it's clear we want them to prioritize further with the recommendations so that we can be more focused, and the equity, enhance on the equity piece in the recommendations. I think, for me, those are two big takeaways. I'd like to hear from others. So Chris and then Flo.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to the public for coming out today and also enduring a 3-hour meeting.
With no break.
With no break, yeah. But this is an important topic, critical topic, and you all acknowledge that in your own way. And I did want to address a couple of practical things that came up earlier and didn't have a chance to address. One is around outreach and how this would be carried out in the cities. I think the Sacramento City came up and gave their perspective. And West Sacramento is updating our climate action plan. We'll be going through an outreach process as well. And we will be making outreach an important part of that to make sure the communities, neighborhoods know. We work with neighborhood groups. One of them is the Broadwick and Bright Community Action Network, which we actually work with for the outreach. So we'll be continuing that process to make sure down to the neighborhood we get that feedback. I just want to make sure I address that issue, because it's important that we connect with the neighborhoods, which leads to how we address the last topic, at least from my perspective. And I think it is important, this nexus between what the TAC addressed, which is around the built environment, land use, and everything downstream. It will be important that we begin to understand that and transit, and not so much as I took note of Cami Boyle. I know spoke. Kimmy, is it Kimmy? I'm sorry. spoke very well and kind of got to a point that I was thinking about in the same vein, which is it's just not enough anymore to say we need to create transit-oriented development. We need to be working as cities to remove some of the barriers that lie between traditional neighborhood development and transit. And that includes quality of the transit, that includes the quality of the neighborhood, the connectedness, the accessibility. All those sorts of things matter. And I know in some of the neighborhoods we have started to develop, we've taken that tact on, we've worked very hard to try to connect that, but there's more ideas to come, and I think that's where I think the tact should go next is what does that mean in tomorrow's world and how can we implement that? And I'm curious around their thoughts around that, especially there is greenfield development still in West Sacramento, and some of it is entitled, and we will have challenges with how to deal with that. But look at how you might incorporate sort of the urban boundary concept to how we deal with new development. And they're entitled, there's legal rights with that, and there's legal risk to that. And when you're asking for resources from a city to invest in the right things, which is around a climate change plan and all its implementation steps, we can't in the same breath take economic risk by going back on entitlement. So we're going to have to figure this out together around how we can address those issues, go to electrification of only in those areas. Maybe that's a way we can do it. And but I'm interested in narrowing that scope a little bit, and more so having them focus on and maybe having the TAC members sit with the mobility groups as they go forward, so that there's a real nexus around those two areas. I think that's two of the areas that I'd ask to go on. The final thought I have is, which is sort of the third rail we're getting to, which is how are we going to fund all this? I was very interested in the presentation by Oakland because it set forth an approach to which the cities and the commission and the cities could implement and have a prioritized list of going forward. Because in the end, we're going to have to fund this some way. It's either going to be funded by cities. We're going to either go try to get grants from like cap and trade to deal with some of the housing issues, or we're going to ask individuals to do it. And that gets into all those issues will resonate down to the neighborhood and down to each one of you, because we're going to ask residents to go in with us to either change out to electric vehicles, to change out to electrified houses, to removing wood-burning fireplaces. All those things have an economic consequence. So I think part of it is we're going to have to kind of get to a financing strategy that's really kind of ready for us to look at some of these issues, and how at the same time we're coming up with the areas is being able to, how we're going to get there financially. And it isn't an if we're going to get there, it's how we're going to get there. And having that at the same time we're having these discussions, it's going to be critical. In post-redevelopment California, the funds just aren't there like they used to be in California. We've developed an enhanced infrastructure financing district, which I've asked our staff to start looking into what kind of, if that infrastructure can include areas of electrifying or whatever else. But we're going to need more tools than that to get to some of these. And it's just a reality of the business we have to do. So that's my recommendation and feedback for the TAC team. But thank you for all your work. It's been great.
Thank you. All right, Flo, but are people willing to go maybe 15 minutes late? Because I'd really like anyone who speaks to, or wants to speak, to have the chance. Sort of, yeah? Yeah, okay, thank you. Flo.
So I want to appreciate all the comments, and thank you to everyone in the public who spoke. I need to take a step back and talk a little bit about process and timeline, because what we heard tonight from the TAC was a great initial brainstorm of all of the possible things that we could potentially do, or maybe not an exhaustive list, but somewhere near that. And so what would be helpful for me to moving forward is we're going to have several more TACs that are going to get together and talk about what their ideas are. And so it would be helpful to know sort of what is our process going to be for coming to consensus on this? What is our process going to be for prioritizing things? And so it might be helpful, and I don't know if we just want to hear all of the ideas first and then begin to plug them into the process or the system that Oakland kind of has already set up. But it's hard for me to respond when I don't know what the impact is going to be on achieving our goal, what the cost of the infrastructure is going to be, what the cost savings are, including what our current spending is in this area and how that will be shifted, who the payers are going to be and what the burden is going to be on each of these payers, and then also what's the equity impact score, and however we decide we're going to define that. But for me, it would be helpful to have some of that information up front as we're considering these ideas, because I don't want to spend a lot of time on something that's a really great idea, as Steve was saying, but isn't going to have an impact on our greenhouse gases, or something that's a really great idea but is completely infeasible in terms of what we have for costs and we don't have an allocated payer. So I guess before I get into the substance of what we have here, I need a little more information to be able to say, like, how can I wrap my brain around these really great ideas to be able to understand where I should place them and where we should place our focus. And so I don't know if we just want to hear all of the ideas and say, wow, that sounds great, and have we thought about, and then do this process, or where this is going to fit in, or if the next step for each of the TACs is to come present ideas, we talk about them, and then they go and do that. But that would be helpful, because otherwise it's just a lot of great ideas roaming around, but not a whole lot of substantive ways we can evaluate them and do a pretty head-to-head comparison, which we're going to have to do at some point in the future. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Great point. I'll just give a couple of responses to that. You heard earlier, Ramey mentioned that there was going to be a quantification on some of the costs and the greenhouse gas emissions. So my hope is that as the city has information that comes out, that we can kind of have an iterative process. So as it comes out, we'll be bringing that back to the commission. And then, of course, as we present the final recommendations, we'll have much more information than we do now. So we're starting with big ideas, and then the fourth TAC will look more at funding and financing. The cities will do a little more of the quantification, and we'll bring that information back as we go. But really good comments.
So just so I'm clear, so up front, we're just considering ideas, even if some of them aren't towards our goal? Because I guess what I'm struggling with right now is we're coming up with these really exhaustive lists, but I want to make sure that if they don't meet the sniff test of, is this going to do what we'd like it to do in some meaningful way, we should not spend time talking about them in this space, right? Certainly we want to prioritize equity, but the first step is we want to get towards our goal. And so if that's not happening, I just don't want us to spend a whole lot of time on things that may not even, meet the initial sniff test. So I'm not sure if we can do this in a more integrated way, where the cities are providing the data before the TAC comes back to us, or how that happens. But this is a lot of manpower, and I'm really appreciative to everyone who participated, but I'm just wondering, in terms of what we end up having, will it feel like it was for naught if many of these things don't end up making the final thing that we end up using, and we spent several meetings talking about them? That's more where my concern is.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Flo. Your comment's good, and I think we're all kind of struggling. At least I'll speak for myself. But, it's daunting. And our task is to give recommendations to the city, not to do the final, plan on the city, for the cities, both of them. So kind of making those two things dovetail, I think, is something that's going to evolve. But definitely, I think we need to go back and think about how we make this work for the commissioners. Do you have something, Obadiah? You look like you wanted to say something.
I just want to comment that prioritization was an element of the TAC discussions. We went through a couple of rounds of prioritization. I would say there are probably about 60 to 70 strategies that were identified, plus a bunch of near-term actions that were identified that have been really culled. So this does represent a down selection, amongst which is really a tremendously broad set of topics to try to tackle. So I did just want to reflect that this is a prioritized set, and I actually found some elements that I probably should have raised earlier, but there are just so many pieces of this that we had. We really were trying to down select, though, but would benefit from some of the financial analysis that's going to be coming with the city to really help in that. And that sounds like that's coming later on in this process.
Okay, Ramey, and then I know I've got Lori and Arlen. It's on this topic, right?
Yes, just in response to the timing, our consultants are scoped to undertake a quantitative GHG reduction analysis and to be able to quantify the GHG reductions of all of these measures after the conclusion of the 3 TACs. So in the fall time period, we would be able to quantify those GHG reduction measures and create a prioritization based on the measures that provide the biggest benefit.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. Lori, and then Arlen.
I think that it's really obvious by all the interest and all the comments here. I just want to bring up a little bit more process. We've got the 3 silos, mobility, built environment, and everything else. I think that there's a real need for those to start to connect sooner rather than later. And also, the community segment that we haven't talked about is bringing in the neighborhoods, either bringing, not necessarily bringing them in, but going out to the neighborhoods, because our TACs are experts, specialists. It's not the community. And I think we might be doing it backwards from what Daniel was talking about, that that we need to bring that in before rather than presenting the community at the very end of these long lists that have been put together, and bring in the neighborhoods to be part of this discussion.
Just a comment on the integration. So we have city staff that are involved in all the TACs, so they will be cutting across all 3. We also have a number of the commissioners that are cutting across all 3, and then, of course, LGC's staff as well, who's staffing the commission. So there will be some natural integration and also very intentional integration through the people, and then also through the strategies that are developed. On the community engagement side, just again to express that we didn't want to create a community engagement process that would muddy the waters with what the city of Sacramento is already doing and the city of West Sacramento is doing with the general plan and the climate action plan updates. So that was not at all part of the budget here. So we've been trying to figure out how do we take advantage as much as possible with the efforts that are already planned and in place, and then making these meetings obviously available to the public, getting information out in terms of social media. We've done some community tabling and the survey, everything we can do that's a little lower touch, since that's not actually a part of this particular process, unfortunately.
Is that going to cause problems down the way when we come up with recommendations and the neighborhoods then say, you know, this isn't what we need?
Okay, I want to let Arlen speak, but maybe just a general response. I think that we really, the work that's been done is great. We're appreciative. I think we need to go back, though, and just kind of rescope our process and figure out how to make this work a little, I don't know, more smoothly, or, you know, bring things together. That being said, I do think we'll need to seek more funding in order to make that happen. So we'll have to be dealing with that as well, and maybe some of you will have ideas. Arlen.
Thank you. I'm not going to speak to the funding. I'll leave that to other folks.
Oh, come on.
I just want to compliment the TAC for the work. I think this is obviously a lot of hard work. For Obadiah, who volunteered to, I think you volunteered to lead this, Obadiah. I just want to note that this is in addition to his full-time job, so it's not like we gave him time to do this. He did this out of a love for the issue, so I really want to applaud him for that. One of the things that I want to fully endorse Flo's comments about the integration, and Kate, I appreciate your comments around that. I think we also need to look at where there are conflicts and where there are overlaps, and how you create a really integrated solution at the end. The other thing is, just for each of the committees, and I would say with the TAC, I appreciate the prioritization that you've done. I think it would, for me personally, as we go through this, it would be helpful, and maybe the city's work will help illuminate some of this, is of those recommendations, what are the things that are relatively low cost, low effort, as opposed to those things that are very high cost, very high effort, and what that continuum looks at. That, to me, tends to focus on where we might focus our initial early recommendations, which might be helpful to Lori's point. We want to make the biggest bang in carbon reduction that we can as fast as we can. So that might help educate us on this. And when you're looking at the carbon, this is a question for the city, just as you're looking at the analysis that you're doing, are you looking at cost also, or is it just carbon reduction potential? And to me, that cost is an important part of what we choose to do.
We'll be looking at cost as well.
Oh, great, great. So those are my primary big. I do want to give a shout out because the tree recommendation, I just want to shout out a partner, the Tree Foundation, which is actually the premier tree organization in the nation. It's true, and so we have a great partner there. And we've actually been started working with them on focusing on our support there for more trees right now in disadvantaged communities. So I just wanted to give a shout out for them as part of that. So those are my comments.
Dave, did you want to speak?
Excuse me. Yes, I would. Just some comments for the TAC. Of course, I really like the emphasis on planting more trees, and hope we'll do it in partnership with the Tree Foundation rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, because the Tree Foundation's been doing this for a long time and they're very good at it. And at Sacramento Association of Realtors, we've been a long-time supporter of the Tree Foundation, so we hope that will happen. We, of course, also support the emphasis on doing more infill housing, energy-efficient infill housing. So we hope that that will be part of what goes on. There are a couple things that I have concern about in the TAC report. The first one I mentioned earlier is the reference about tax revenues and the limitations on being able to do that effectively. OBDI did say they didn't really look at that closely yet, so hopefully they will when it goes back to them. The other thing that I would like to mention, there's a provision in there on under existing residential construction, talking about the permitting process and going back and looking at permits on properties. And I just want to point out that would have to be in conjunction with what was passed last year, Senate Bill 1226, because Senate Bill 1226 says that if you have a property which improvements were done and they didn't draw a permit, that once you find that there is a permit, the limitation on the jurisdiction is to determine the date in which the improvements were done and require an improvement only to what the code was on the day that the improvements were done. And so that maybe have some impact on how much traction you can get with doing that if you're limited, that you can only go back and do certain improvements. The other thing, that there's a reference in there to a point of sale, and we just always argue that point of sale is an extremely inefficient way of getting things done, because in any given year, on average, about 2% of the houses sell, and the majority of the houses that sell are the newer construction. Older homes don't sell that often, and older homes are where we're going to get most of the bang for the buck. So a point of sale is not going to be a really effective way of doing it. We hope that they would develop some strategies for more effective voluntary implementation. Sacramento Association of Realtors, in conjunction with the Air District and with SMUD, Rebuilding Together, has had a program for several years called the Home Energy Conservation Program. Now, because it's Rebuilding Together, they're limited to owner-occupied properties with people that are on fixed incomes. But we've provided almost $200,000 worth of funding between the agencies involved. And they go into these houses and they do Tier 1 upgrades. And the people that are involved, the engineers involved in it, say that every house that we do a Tier 1 upgrade takes 1 ton of emissions out of the air per year. And we do that for about $200 per house, and it saves the homeowners about $300 per year on their utility bills. So it's a very cost-effective way to drive this through a voluntary program, and hopefully some program could be developed that build upon that concept, that expanded further, because Rebuilding Together, with their charter, they can't go any further than fixed income owner-occupied properties. But I think that you could expand on the same concept and get a lot of traction with voluntary compliance rather than forced compliance, because there's a lot of people out there would like to have this done, just their resources are very limited. And by using this program, we go in and we pay the cost of doing those Tier 1 upgrades, and it's not a cost to them, and they get reduced utility bills. So hopefully you can look at being able to implement some of that into some of the things that you're trying to do.
Thanks, Dave. Julia, and then Stephanie.
So I have a long list of questions. Can you set a deadline for us to email them to you because we're running out of time? And then I have two that I want to say out loud.
Okay.
Okay. So the first is, it sounds like there's an opportunity to talk about things that are already happening, like the MTP and the Sustainable Community Strategies. And, asking the question, did we already consider everything that's underway? And how do we participate if the MTP is due in 9 months? So that's a first, and, tree master plan. What are the things that are already in process, and did the built environment TAC already talk about those things? Second is, and this is, I'm just going to drop the bomb, which is if PG&E goes bankrupt, is there an opportunity for someone to go into Yolo County? So I'm going to think big and bold and transformative. And can we just at least have a placeholder for that, since I have nothing to lose in saying that?
For the record, Julia said that, not me.
I said it. Yep, I said it because I don't have an affiliation with any of that right now. And so let's add that to the list. And then finally, in addition to inventorying what's already happening, did the built environment TAC look at these menus that Oakland and Detroit and Washington, D.C. and everybody else already consider? So it's tailored to Sacramento, but I think one more look at everything that the best cities in the world, not just the country, have done is a suggestion. And then I just want to iterate as my last point that I really do think we need a community engagement strategy. We've heard that loud and clear tonight, and whatever support you need from the Climate Commission to second and third that, take the best practices from what has already been done and really make this plan ours and represent all the voices of the community. We have to do that. We have to have a strategy. Yeah.
Just in terms of timing, the last built environment TAC is March 25th, so we'll need it a few business days. Any questions you have a few business days before that to get that to the TAC.
By this
Friday.
Thursday,
How about
Friday?
Friday?
Okay.
Okay. Stephanie?
Julia said what I was going to say about community engagement.
Well,
I'm good.
Okay, got it. Okay. Have I forgotten anyone or anyone else? All right. Thank you, everyone. So if you have things that you didn't get to say or comments you want to add about the built environment recommendations, send those to LGC by the end of the week. Next steps are the built environment TAC will convene for a fourth meeting, and we'll huddle after this meeting and coordinate your next steps based on the input we got. The mobility TAC will be launching shortly. And the youth summits, both of them in April, so hopefully folks can participate in that. And Kate and I and the team, and anyone who wants to help us, welcome any assistance, but we'll take to heart the comments around community engagement, as well as just rethinking our process and how to better enable this group to make decisions and how to integrate everything. So those are my big takeaways. There'll probably be more after we review all the notes. There were many great comments. So thank you all for participating. We'll send out a doodle poll soon for the next meeting. And thank you, public, for being here, and thanks everyone for staying late.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.